He agreed to date the ugliest girl in the office, just to help his best friend. But when she showed up, he was speechless. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Thomas Bennett woke to the faint hum of traffic drifting through the tall windows of his sleek apartment in San Francisco's Soma district. At 35, he possessed most of what his college self had once dreamed of. A high-paying marketing position at Westbridge Solutions, a comfortable loft with modern furniture, and a full social calendar of parties and casual dates. Yet as the early morning light crept across the polished floors, a subtle hollowness accompanied his daily routine. He brewed a pot of coffee, glancing at the framed photo on the kitchen counter, an old snapshot of him and his best friend, Carlos Jimenez, back when they were wide-eyed high school kids in Seattle. Carlos had once defended Thomas from bullies who mocked his worn-out shoes and lack of confidence. Now the roles felt reversed. Thomas was the one gliding through life with outward ease, while Carlos navigated a quieter path in the tech department at the same company. Sipping from his mug, Thomas checked his messages. There was a short text from his mother, Diane, who still lived in Seattle. "Hey, sweetheart, call me soon. Missing you." He felt a pang of guilt for not visiting her more often, but he pushed it aside. The day ahead was jam-packed with meetings, and he was determined to secure a new client by the end of the month. Relationship matters, real, serious relationships, always took a back seat to professional goals. The commute through downtown San Francisco was briefer than usual, traffic lights almost synchronized in his favor. He arrived at the high-rise housing Westbridge Solutions and stepped into the sleek lobby, greeting the security guard with a nod. By the time he reached the marketing floor, he was already scrolling through emails, mentally ticking off tasks. He was halfway to his office when Helena, an accountant from the finance department, walked by, almost unnoticed. She was 33, with her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the usual loose sweater and a pair of glasses that looked a size too large for her face. Most people in the company referred to her as invisible or dull, dismissing her quiet demeanor and unremarkable style of dress. Thomas himself had barely shared more than a polite nod with her. Yet something about Helena's presence that morning caught his eye. She moved briskly, holding a stack of paperwork as if it were precious cargo. The faint, determined look in her eyes made him pause momentarily. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. He headed to his office, the memory of Helena's focused expression lingering in the back of his mind. An hour later, the stress of the day began to mount. Thomas had a call with a major client that left him feeling drained. No matter how hard he pitched, the potential deal seemed to be slipping away. Right then, Carlos slipped in through the door, a playful grin across his face. "Am I interrupting?" Carlos asked, glancing at the messy pile of documents on Thomas's desk. Thomas leaned back in his chair, relieved to see a familiar face. "Not at all. I could use a break." Carlos, slightly older at 36, had a warm presence that was disarming. His hair was kept short, and he dressed more casually than the standard Westbridge employee, jeans and a neat polo. He carried a small device in his hand, some new gadget he'd been tinkering with in the IT lab. After a few casual remarks, Carlos got straight to the point. "So, I've been trying to ask out Bethany. You remember her, right? She works with Helena in the finance department." Thomas nodded. "Sure, I've seen her around. She's in the compliance section, right?" Carlos smiled a bit sheepishly. "Yeah, that's her. We've been chatting lately, and I think she might be interested. But here's the catch. She refuses to go out unless her friend comes along." "That friend, by the way, is Helena." Thomas exhaled, anticipating where this was going. "And you want me to—" "Help me out, man," Carlos pleaded. "Bethany says Helena's not comfortable going out alone, so if I can arrange a double date. It increases my chances. You'd be doing me a huge favor." Leaning forward, Thomas felt a pinch of hesitation. Yes, he'd do almost anything for Carlos. But Helena, quiet, unremarkable Helena who rarely made eye contact with anyone. He pictured her solemn face, those oversized glasses, the baggy cardigans, not exactly his usual type. Nor did he imagine they'd share any real chemistry. Yet he couldn't simply refuse. Carlos had been a rock in his life for years. "All right, but you owe me one," Thomas said finally, trying to sound casual. Deep down, he felt an odd mixture of reluctance and curiosity. He reminded himself this was purely for Carlos's benefit, and there was no expectation of anything long-term. They wrapped up their chat with a firm handshake. Once alone, Thomas stared at the spreadsheet glowing on his computer screen, finding it suddenly impossible to focus. Thoughts of Helena, reserved, quiet Helena, kept drifting into his mind. He brushed the notion aside and returned to work, unaware that he had already taken a small but significant step into a different trajectory. The next day began in a whirlwind of tasks. Thomas barely had time to scarf down a quick bagel before dashing to a project briefing. By mid-morning, the marketing team gathered in a glass-walled conference room on the 30th floor. There, Martin Reynolds, Thomas's direct supervisor, discussed budget allocations for an upcoming campaign. Martin, at 50, was a formidable figure with salt and pepper hair and a brisk manner that bordered on abrasive. He'd been pushing everyone hard to secure new clients, and the meeting droned on with talk of potential partnerships and quarterly goals. Thomas scribbled notes, but his mind strayed to Carlos's request the previous day. Carlos had not yet mentioned any details, where the double date would happen, what day or time. Still, the notion of seeing Helena in a social setting felt odd. He recalled how she'd seemed so distant, almost invisible, in the corridors. Could they even carry a conversation over dinner? After the meeting, Thomas caught up with Carlos near the break room. It was a cramped space with a small fridge and a perpetually broken coffee machine. Carlos was fiddling with a plastic coffee stirrer, lost in thought. "Hey," Thomas said, leaning against the doorframe. "So, about that date you were talking about." Carlos's eyes lit up, though he kept his voice low. "Man, thanks for not shutting me down. Bethany told me Helena might be free this coming Saturday. She said she'd only say yes if Helena feels comfortable." Thomas crossed his arms. "Is Helena even aware of this plan? I don't want to ambush her." With a slight cringe, Carlos admitted, "Bethany's doing the groundwork, but Helena's not exactly sold on the idea. Well, you know how quiet she is, but Bethany believes Helena will agree if the person is, I quote, polite, open-minded, and doesn't have any wild expectations." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "They do know I'm basically the poster child for short-term flings, right?" Carlos laughed. "That's your old reputation, man. Also, I think Bethany deliberately didn't mention it to Helena that you're the one going out with her. But yeah, you might need to dial down the party guy vibe if this is going to work." Thomas shoved his hands into his pockets, feeling a twinge of annoyance. He wasn't entirely comfortable being seen as a shallow player, even if he'd fed that image plenty of times in the past. "Okay, so I'll do it," he said at last, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "But only because I want to help you. And because it sounds like Helena could use a nice evening, even if she doesn't realize it yet." Carlos grinned, relief washing over him. "Thanks, buddy. Bethany and I owe you big time." Thomas gave a half smile and wandered off, trying to focus on the files he needed to review. But the day took an unexpected turn when he ran into Helena in the hallway after lunch. She was carrying a binder labeled Tax Compliance, Confidential, her face partially hidden by those thick-framed glasses. "Oh, hi," she said softly, almost colliding with him as she turned a corner. Thomas noticed a slight flush on her cheeks. "Sorry," he replied, stepping back. He tried to think of something friendly to say, but blurted, "You, heading to the finance department?" She gave a tentative nod. "Yes. We've got some new auditing guidelines from the main office. It's quite a handful." For a moment, Thomas studied her face. He noticed she had delicate features, gentle eyes, a narrow nose. If she only wore more fashionable glasses or let her hair down. He stopped himself, realizing how superficial his thoughts sounded. "You seem busy," he said, not sure how else to fill the awkward silence. She mustered a polite smile. "Busy is good. At least it keeps me out of trouble." Thomas chuckled lightly. "I guess so. Anyway, I won't keep you. Good luck with those guidelines." He watched her walk away, suddenly struck by the contrast between her timid exterior and the brief flicker of wry humor in her voice. There was something more to Helena than the standard office gossip suggested. That evening, after hours, Thomas found a note from Carlos on his desk. It read, "Bethany is setting up dinner for Saturday night. She's trying to get Helena on board. Let's keep our fingers crossed." Thomas folded the note and put it in his pocket. It dawned on him that he was diving into this without any real sense of what might happen. He'd simply agreed to do Carlos a favor. How complicated could it be? But an unfamiliar restlessness followed him home, tugging at the edges of his carefully constructed life. By Wednesday morning, a sense of apprehension had settled in Thomas's chest. He'd confirmed with Carlos that Helena was tentatively willing to join them for dinner, provided no big surprises happened. Yet Thomas couldn't shake his own doubts. He sat at his desk, trying to hammer out a draft proposal for a new marketing campaign, but every time he typed a sentence, he found himself rethinking Saturday's arrangement. He didn't know Helena at all. Their only interactions had been fleeting corridor hellos and that awkward moment with the auditing binder. He was accustomed to casual dates, but typically with women who shared his social circles, attended corporate mixers, or were introduced through mutual acquaintances who liked to party. Late in the afternoon, he decided to call Carlos for a quick chat. "Why can't Bethany and Helena just go out with you separately? This double date idea, do we really need it?" On the other end of the line, Carlos sighed. "Dude, you know how some people feel safer with a friend around. Bethany told me Helena has had some tough experiences in the past, guys who thought she was an easy target, just because she's quiet. I guess she's protective of Bethany, or maybe Bethany is protective of her. Who knows? But if we do this, I'm sure it'll help break the ice." Thomas tapped his pen on the desk, suddenly feeling a pang of sympathy. "I didn't realize Helena had been through that. It's pretty messed up. I just don't want her to think I'm being coerced into this." "You're not," Carlos replied gently. "I told you, if you're uncomfortable, we can cancel. But from what Bethany says, Helena seems on board, or at least not entirely against it. Look, I'll handle all the details. We'll make it a small dinner at a quiet place. No pressure." "No pressure," Thomas echoed, ending the call. Still, as the day edged into evening, he felt a mounting anxiety. He thought back to how people at Westbridge Solutions described Helena: invisible, plain, always in the background. He realized that he'd never bothered to look deeper. What kind of person was she behind that cautious demeanor? Did he even have anything meaningful to talk about with her, beyond polite small talk? On Thursday, the tension rose further. Martin Reynolds, the supervisor, cornered Thomas after a staff briefing and criticized his recent performance. "You seem distracted," Martin said, arms folded. "We need closers in this department, Bennett. If you can't land that new client, maybe I'll assign it to someone more focused." Thomas bit back a defensive remark and forced a smile. "I'm on it, Martin. You'll have the pitch deck by Monday." He spent the afternoon trying to salvage the pitch, but his attention kept drifting. By the time he left the office, it was dark outside. He skipped his usual Thursday night outing with some friends at a trendy bar, deciding instead to grab takeout and reflect. As he ate, he scrolled through social media, stumbling upon Helena's profile in the process, an almost empty page with a single profile picture of her at a conference. She wore the same large-framed glasses, her expression calm, as if politely enduring the photographer's request. "It's just dinner," Thomas whispered to himself, placing his phone aside. "This isn't some life-altering event." But the following morning, he woke with a faint knot in his stomach. Saturday loomed on the horizon, and he still hadn't mustered genuine enthusiasm. The more he thought about how he'd been roped into this date, the more uneasy he felt. Sure, it was a favor for Carlos, but it also touched on something deeper. For years, Thomas had avoided letting people see beneath his well-polished surface. Going out with Helena might force him to slow down and actually be real. He arrived at the office with a plan: bury himself in work, finalize his marketing pitch, and ignore the internal debates swirling in his mind. Yet each time he glimpsed Helena from across the open floor, her posture slightly hunched as she typed away at spreadsheets, he felt a nagging sense of responsibility. Was he about to treat her like a charity case or a mere obligation? That afternoon, he spotted Helena once again in the company cafeteria. She was sitting alone, flipping through a worn paperback novel. His footsteps faltered. Should he join her? Say something encouraging about Saturday? Or would that be too forward? The tension in his chest tightened. In the end, he walked away, choosing silence over potentially making things more complicated. He told himself it was better this way, less chance of saying something awkward or giving her the wrong idea. Saturday, after all, would come soon enough. And he was anything but ready. Saturday morning arrived with a rush of sunlight pouring into Thomas's loft. Instead of the usual excitement he felt before a fun weekend plan, he woke up feeling like he had a looming presentation he hadn't prepared for. He stared at the ceiling, recalling his last conversation with Carlos. Everything was set for that evening at a cozy restaurant near Fisherman's Wharf. While brewing coffee, Thomas checked his phone. No new messages from Carlos or Helena. Part of him hoped something would come up and cancel the night, while another part felt guilty, wishing for that. He remembered the fleeting moments he'd observed Helena in the office, her diligence and the quiet confidence she exuded when working through complex financial data. He wanted to discover if there was more to her, but he also feared disappointing her or letting the evening become an awkward mess. Determined to clear his head, he decided on a short run along the Embarcadero. The crisp bay air usually helped him decompress, but today his mind buzzed with scenarios of how dinner might unfold. Would Helena be standoffish, or would she open up once away from the office? He couldn't be sure. When he returned, sweaty and flushed, he found a missed call from Carlos. He returned it quickly. "Hey, what's up?" Carlos's voice crackled with excitement. "Nothing major, just checking in. Bethany told me Helena is definitely coming. I thought you'd want to know." Thomas forced a laugh. "I appreciate the heads up." Carlos hesitated. "Look, if you're nervous, don't be. Helena's actually really nice when you get to know her, and I think she's trying to break out of her shell. Maybe all she needs is a gentle push." As they hung up, Thomas felt the weight of the unspoken question. Could he be that gentle push? Or would he just confirm her worst assumptions about men only interested in shallow appearances? He spent much of the afternoon pacing around his apartment, picking out a shirt, then discarding it, switching ties, and eventually settling on something simple, no suit, just a crisp button-down and dark jeans. Around 5, he grabbed his keys, hopped into his car, and headed to the restaurant, the Windmill, known for its warm atmosphere and comforting American dishes. Inside, he spotted Carlos and Bethany already seated at a table near the window. Carlos stood up, flashing his usual grin. Bethany, a petite woman with short blonde hair, offered a friendly wave. "Thomas, so glad you could make it," Bethany said, her tone warm. "Helena is on her way. She texted me that she's parking." Thomas nodded, sliding into the seat across from them. He couldn't deny the nerves fluttering in his stomach. Within minutes, Helena appeared at the entrance, scanning the tables with a cautious look. Thomas stood, noting that she wore a modest but flattering navy dress, and her hair was loosely tied in a low ponytail. The same glasses rested on her nose, but something about her seemed softer, more open. She approached, and Bethany greeted her with a quick hug. "Helena, this is Thomas," she said, gesturing politely. Thomas extended a hand. "Nice to see you outside of the office for a change." Her expression revealed a trace of uncertainty, but she managed a polite smile. "Yes, likewise." They all took their seats. Carlos and Bethany started with easy banter about work, technology updates, and a recent glitch in the company's finance software. Thomas glanced at Helena, searching for a natural conversation starter. "Bethany told me you're the brains behind those new budget projections," he said quietly, leaning in so Helena could hear him over the low buzz of chatter. She shrugged. "I just run the numbers. The real challenge is getting people to pay attention to what the numbers mean." Thomas smirked. "Well, you made me pay attention when you flagged issues in my team's expense sheets a few months back." Her eyes widened slightly. "I hope that didn't cause too much trouble." "Not at all. You saved us from overspending, actually. I, never properly thanked you." Before Helena could reply, the waitress arrived to take their drink orders. They settled on a bottle of red wine to share, and Thomas felt a wave of relief at the interruption. He needed a second to compose himself. As conversation flowed, mostly guided by Carlos and Bethany, Thomas noticed Helena relaxing bit by bit. She laughed softly at one of Carlos's jokes, and her posture seemed less guarded. At one point, Thomas caught her glancing in his direction, curiosity flickering in her eyes. He wondered if she, too, was thinking how strange it was to share a table after months of passing each other in hallways without more than a nod. The sense of pressure from earlier in the day didn't vanish, but it transformed into a cautious hope. Perhaps, he realized, the real question wasn't about impressing Helena. It was about whether he could allow himself to genuinely connect with someone he barely knew, something he hadn't done in a very long time. By the time their entrees arrived, the initial stiffness had begun to melt away. The restaurant's warm lighting and the comforting scent of freshly baked bread seemed to encourage a more genuine atmosphere. Carlos and Bethany engaged in playful banter about weekend plans, their easy rapport suggesting a budding romance. Meanwhile, Thomas and Helena found themselves in a cautious but intriguing exchange of questions and observations. "So," Helena asked gently, "you've been at Westbridge Solutions for a while now, right? Carlos mentioned you were one of the earliest hires in the marketing division." Thomas nodded, slicing into his grilled chicken. "I joined about 5 years ago, back when we were just a small team. I've seen the place expand like crazy. And you, I heard you came on board almost 2 years ago." Helena sipped her water before answering. "Yes, it was right after I moved from Seattle. My mother, she was ill at the time, and I wanted a job that offered good health benefits and stability. Westbridge seemed like a solid choice." Thomas caught himself leaning in, genuinely curious. "Is she doing better now?" Helena paused, her gaze momentarily distant. "She passed away a few months ago. Chronic heart condition, but she fought it for a long time." A somber hush fell over the small corner of the table. Thomas's chest tightened. He recognized the subtle pain in her voice. This wasn't something she often talked about. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, regretful if he'd stepped into painful territory. "It's all right." She managed a tiny smile. "She's at peace now, and I'm finding my own footing here, just Sometimes I feel like I've been floating under the radar, focused on work to keep my mind busy. Thomas nodded in understanding. I can relate, in a way. Work can be a shield, right? You wrap yourself in deadlines and spreadsheets so you don't have to face life's bigger questions. She studied him. I never thought you'd understand that. He chuckled softly, glancing at Carlos and Bethany, who were momentarily engrossed in their own conversation. I might give off a party guy vibe, but I've had my share of disappointments. It's easier to pretend everything is fine than to admit you're lonely sometimes. Helena's eyes flickered with empathy. Before she could respond, Bethany turned to them with a bright smile. Hey, you two? We're thinking of heading to that little cafe next door for dessert. Join us. Helena hesitated, looking at Thomas with uncertainty, but he gave an encouraging nod. Why not? They settled the bill and moved to a quaint cafe known for homemade pies and pastries. A pianist played softly in the corner, adding an elegant touch to the dimly lit space. As they found a small table, Thomas noticed Helena fiddling with the edge of her sweater sleeve, a nervous habit he'd seen her do at work. Sensing she might be a bit overwhelmed, he turned the conversation to lighter topics, asking about her favorite books and discovering her fondness for classic literature, particularly Russian novels. Tolstoy, he repeated. I've heard of War and Peace, but I can't say I've braved it. Helena laughed quietly. It's not exactly light reading, but there's something about the emotional depth that resonates with me. It shows how people change when confronted with massive upheaval, like war or societal shifts. Sounds intense, Thomas admitted, though he found himself intrigued by her passion. Maybe I'll give it a try someday. Bethany and Carlos soon finished their pastries and stood to leave, politely excusing themselves with the universal pretext of an early start the next day. Thomas suspected they wanted to give him and Helena some space to talk. Helena also seemed to realize this as her cheeks flushed slightly. I guess it's just us, she said, offering a tentative smile. Thomas leaned back in his chair, trying to project a calm he didn't entirely feel. We can head out if you prefer. I don't want to keep you. She glanced around the cozy cafe, the pianist's tune rolling gently in the background. Actually, let's stay a bit longer. I could use the break from Excel sheets and budgets. They spent another half hour chatting about mundane yet strangely intimate details. Favorite childhood memories, their contrasting high school experiences, and the differences between Seattle's rainy days and San Francisco's foggy mornings. Thomas felt a subtle shift in the air, as if with each anecdote they were peeling back layers of guardedness. Eventually, Helena realized it was late. She gathered her purse and rose from the chair. Outside, the night air was brisk, tinged with the scent of salt from the nearby bay. Thomas walked her to her car, an older model sedan that, like her, seemed understated yet dependable. Thank you for tonight, she said softly, meeting his eyes. I wasn't sure what to expect, but this was surprisingly nice. Thomas smiled. I'm glad. Maybe we can do it again sometime. She nodded, though the shyness returned to her features. We'll see, she murmured with a small, genuine curve of her lips. As she drove away, Thomas felt a mix of relief and excitement. He realized he'd taken a step outside his familiar world of short-lived thrills. This wasn't just a favor for Carlos anymore. It was the beginning of something else. Whether it was friendship, romance, or simply a deeper understanding of a person he'd overlooked, he couldn't be certain. But the faint possibility of real connection tugged at him, urging him not to ignore it. Standing under the street lamp, Thomas let out a long breath. He thought of all his well-worn assumptions about relationships. In a single evening, Helena had quietly disrupted many of them. His phone buzzed with a text from Carlos. Thanks again. Hope everything went okay. Thomas glanced at Helena's car, disappearing around the corner. Yes, he thought, everything might be more than okay. Thomas woke early on Monday, still carrying the warmth of his Saturday night memories with Helena. While he wouldn't call their first shared evening an outright success, there had been moments of hesitation. It had also been far more pleasant than he expected. He found himself wanting to talk to someone about it. Naturally, the first candidate was Carlos, but Thomas hesitated. Carlos already knew the broad strokes. Maybe what Thomas really needed was an outside perspective. After work, he ducked into a small cafe near Union Square, wanting a quiet space to think. To his surprise, he found an unlikely companion already there. Harriet Lewinsky, a senior director from another department at Westbridge Solutions. Harriet was in her late 40s, known for her sharp intellect and fair-minded approach. She had a calm aura about her, a type of confidence that came from years of navigating corporate dynamics. They recognized each other from interdepartmental meetings, but had never spoken much beyond polite greetings. "Thomas Bennett," she greeted, setting down a porcelain teacup on the wooden table. "Fancy seeing you here." "You waiting for someone?" He shook his head, glancing at the half-empty cafe. "No, I was just looking for a place to clear my mind." Harriet offered a gentle smile. "Sounds like you could use some company. Care to join me?" Thomas hesitated, but then thought, why not? It wasn't like he had urgent plans. He took a seat. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and baked pastries, a comforting backdrop to what soon became a surprisingly candid conversation. "How are things in marketing?" Harriet asked, sipping her tea. Thomas shrugged. "Busy, same old demands for growth and client acquisitions. I'm sure you know how Martin can be." Harriet nodded, her brow tightening. "I'm aware. He's not the easiest person to work with. I'm glad I'm not under his direct supervision anymore." After a brief, mutual laugh, the conversation drifted onto personal matters. Thomas mentioned, in vague terms, that he'd recently had dinner with someone from the finance department, someone who challenged his assumptions. Harriet's interest piqued. "Oh, and how did that go?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. "It was enlightening. I thought we wouldn't have much in common, but it turned out she's genuinely fascinating. Intelligent, kind, and with a different view on life than I'm used to." Harriet set her cup down. "You sound both intrigued and uncertain," he exhaled, folding his arms. I went out with her mostly as a favor to a friend. Now I'm realizing I might actually want to get to know her better, but I worry she'll think I'm insincere." Harriet considered this, then said, "Perhaps you should show genuine interest by taking small steps. Don't rush into sweeping gestures. It often scares people off. Consistency is more convincing than words alone." Thomas was struck by Harriet's insight, especially given that they'd never had a real conversation before. "You're right," he finally replied. "I guess I'm used to a more direct approach." She smiled knowingly. "Thomas, people see you as confident, maybe even a bit flashy. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want someone to see the real you, you'll have to slow down and let them in gradually." The practical yet empathetic guidance settled into his mind. It dawned on him that Harriet, in her own understated way, might be exactly the sounding board he needed. After all, she'd climbed the corporate ladder without sacrificing her sense of fairness and calm. By the time Thomas left the cafe, he felt as though he'd gained a mentor, someone who, while not exactly dispensing life coach slogans, had offered direction with warmth. He decided to follow her advice and show Helena that he respected her boundaries and valued her as a person. That evening, he drafted a short email to Helena. Subject: "Quick thanks. Hi, Helena. I just wanted to say I really appreciated talking with you on Saturday. It was nice to finally get to know the person behind all those brilliant financial reports. If you're ever up for coffee, no pressure, let me know. If not, no worries. Just wanted to express my gratitude. Thomas. He kept it brief, not wanting to overwhelm her. Before hitting send, he reread the message, ensuring the tone was friendly and unassuming. Satisfied, he clicked and sent it off, feeling a flutter of anticipation. Days passed with no immediate reply. Thomas told himself not to overthink it. Helena had a demanding job and might need time to process her own feelings, or maybe she simply felt no need to respond. He busied himself with his workload, trying to be more present and less reliant on reflexive displays of confidence. Late on Thursday afternoon, a small notification popped up on his screen. An email from Helena. "Hi, Thomas. Thanks for the note. Saturday was unexpectedly pleasant. I'm quite busy these days, but a coffee break does sound nice at some point. I'll be in touch when things slow down." It wasn't an outright invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. Thomas felt a subtle grin spread across his face. Harriet's advice about patience and consistency played over in his thoughts like a gentle refrain. He tucked Helena's email away in his mind as a sign of cautious hope. He realized that, in ways big and small, he was already crossing a threshold, leaving behind the old patterns of quick romances and superficial chats. And although the path forward felt uncharted, he sensed he had the beginnings of a guiding light, thanks to an unexpected mentor and a simple but genuine connection. Early Saturday morning, Thomas found himself declining a text invitation to a downtown party that night. Normally, he'd jump at the chance to socialize with old friends in a flashy environment, but something held him back now. The city glistened outside his loft's windows, promising endless diversions, yet he felt compelled to invest his time differently. For one, he wanted to stay focused on the upcoming presentation he was preparing for Martin Reynolds. More importantly, he realized how easily he used to hide behind bars and clubs, places where the music was loud enough to drown out deeper thoughts. Helena's quiet presence and Harriet's measured guidance had begun to peel away layers of that habit. Instead, Thomas decided to work from a small co-working space near Fisherman's Wharf for a few hours. He hoped the fresh environment would spur his creativity. Late morning found him hunched over his laptop, going through slides on new marketing strategies. He was so engrossed that he nearly missed a call from Carlos. "Hey, man!" Carlos's voice sounded unusually cheerful. "I thought you'd be out painting the town red." Thomas chuckled, closing his laptop momentarily. "Not tonight. I've got a big presentation to finalize. Besides, I'm sort of re-evaluating my life choices." Carlos whistled. "That's a phrase I never expected to hear from you. Everything okay?" Thomas hesitated. "I'm good. Actually, better than I've been in a while. I'm just not in the mood for the usual scene, you know?" He could practically see Carlos's eyebrows shooting up. "Does this have anything to do with Helena?" A warm embarrassment crept over Thomas. "Partly, yes, but it's more than that. Talking with her made me realize that I've been stuck in a routine that doesn't give me a whole lot of meaning. It's not all about some life-altering epiphany, but I want something more real." Carlos's teasing tone softened. "I get it. To be honest, I've noticed the change in you, and I think it's a step in a good direction. Anyway, I called because Bethany and I were thinking of having a casual get-together next week at her place. Nothing huge, just a small group of co-workers. She'd love it if you and Helena joined." Thomas felt a flicker of enthusiasm. "That sounds nice. I can't promise Helena will come, but I'll see if she's interested." After they hung up, Thomas immersed himself in his slides for another few hours. He left the co-working space in the late afternoon, feeling simultaneously productive and restless. He'd turned away from his old habits, but now he sensed a gap, Was he lonely? Possibly, but he also felt strangely grounded. Before heading home, he stopped by a local bookstore. The memory of Helena mentioning her love of classic literature nudged him. Wandering through the fiction section, he paused at a copy of War and Peace. He flipped through the pages, imagining the thousands of thoughts swirling in those dense paragraphs. Bold move, he chuckled to himself, but maybe worth trying. Back at his apartment, he sent Helena a short message. "Hey Helena, Carlos and Bethany are planning a small gathering next week. Nothing fancy, just a few folks chatting over snacks. They'd love if we came. No pressure, but let me know if you're up for it. Hope you're having a relaxed weekend, Thomas." He placed his phone aside, telling himself not to check it every few minutes. Instead, he opened the thick novel he'd just purchased, determined to give it an honest try. The first few pages were slow-going, full of Russian nobility and names he could barely pronounce. Still, he found a spark of motivation. This wasn't a fling or a quick fix. It was something that demanded sustained attention, much like his evolving bond with Helena. An hour later, he realized his phone had buzzed. He glanced down to see a reply from Helena. "Thomas, that sounds nice. I'll check my schedule, but if I'm free, I'd like to go. Thanks for letting me know." H. A small thrill shot through him. This subtle sign that she was open to spending more time together felt more significant than any party invitation he'd received in years. He texted Carlos to confirm the plan, then closed his phone to avoid the temptation of overthinking. That night, alone in his quiet loft, Thomas didn't feel bored or isolated. He felt a sense of possibility, as though the life he'd always known was gently receding, making room for something new. Yes, he was parting with old habits. And yes, it felt both scary and invigorating, but Harriet's words echoed in his mind. Consistency matters more than flashy gestures. He realized that by stepping away from his habitual nightlife and taking these small steps, he was steadily crossing the threshold into a deeper, more authentic way of living. Wednesday evening came faster than Thomas expected. Bethany's apartment was in a modest but comfortable neighborhood of San Francisco, a few blocks from Golden Gate Park. He parked his car on the street, feeling a slight pang of nerves. After all, this would be the first time he and Helena spent social time together in a casual group setting, without the protective structure of a planned double date. He carried a small bouquet of flowers, thinking it would be a nice gesture for Bethany. The hallway leading to her apartment smelled of cooking spices and fresh paint. When he knocked, Bethany swung open the door, greeting him with a bright smile. "Thomas, so glad you could make it." She accepted the flowers graciously. "Come on in. Carlos is in the kitchen, trying not to burn the appetizers." The living room was cozy, decorated with simple furniture and personal touches. Photos of Bethany's travels, a plush throw blanket draped over a love seat, and a few quirky souvenirs on shelves. Two co-workers from the finance department chatted in one corner, sipping sodas. Thomas recognized them, but had never spoken much to them. Then he saw Helena. She sat near a low coffee table, looking slightly uncomfortable but managing a friendly smile as one of the co-workers recounted a funny anecdote about office life. She wore a soft grey sweater and dark jeans, simple clothes. But he noticed she seemed more at ease than usual. As he approached, her eyes brightened. "Hey," she greeted. "I wasn't sure if you'd make it on time." Thomas laughed. "Punctuality has never been my strong suit, but I'm trying." "By the way, you look nice. Comfortable." "Thanks," she replied, her voice carrying a softness that held none of the tension he remembered from their early interactions at work. Before they could delve deeper, Bethany called them into the kitchen to sample the appetizers. Carlos stood by the stove, wearing an apron with a cartoon print. He turned and flashed Thomas a grateful smile. "My man, you made it. Now the party can really start." Helena hovered near the counter, occasionally nibbling on a tortilla chip. Thomas noticed she eyed him from time to time, as if waiting to see how he'd behave in a group. Meanwhile, Bethany poured drinks, wine, sparkling water, or juice, letting everyone choose their preference. Soon, 5 or 6 people gathered in the living room. One co-worker pulled out a board game, but conversation flowed freely, so they never ended up playing. Thomas found himself next to Helena on the couch, exchanging small remarks about the workday. Every now and then, Carlos or Bethany would throw a teasing comment their way, hinting at some budding connection. Helena would smile faintly, cheeks tinging pink, but she didn't recoil or show discomfort, an encouraging sign. At one point, talk turned to personal hobbies. Bethany asked Helena about her love of reading, and Helena admitted she was currently making her way through some lesser-known Tolstoy short stories. Thomas, eager to share his progress, chimed in. "I actually started War and Peace. Well, barely, but I'm trying to give it a real effort." Helena's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. "Really? That's ambitious. What made you decide to pick it up?" Thomas shrugged, trying not to sound too earnest. "You mentioned Russian literature the other day. I realized I'd been dodging anything heavier than business magazines for a long time." Her face lit with a kind of quiet pride. "That's great. If you ever need a reading buddy, let me know. It can be a tough one to tackle alone." He smiled, heartened by her encouragement. A moment of quiet understanding passed between them, though the rest of the room bustled with laughter and chatter. Later in the evening, Helena slipped onto the small balcony to get some fresh air. Thomas followed, finding her leaning against the railing, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "I'm glad you came," she said without turning around, as if speaking to the night sky. Thomas stood beside her, resting his arms on the rail. "I am too. It's nice to see you outside the office." She gave him a sideways glance, a subtle softness in her expression. "You seem different lately. Not in a bad way, just more grounded." A quiet laugh escaped him. "I guess I'm learning there's more to life than I let myself see before. Maybe you had something to do with that." Helena lowered her gaze, a light smile touching her lips. "It's refreshing. I mean, the Thomas I used to hear about was someone who, well, let's just say he lived for the next big party. I didn't think he could handle a quiet conversation about literature." He breathed out a chuckle, feeling the cool night air on his face. "People can surprise you, can't they?" She nodded, and for a moment they stood there in comfortable silence, the distant hum of city traffic blending with the soft laughter from inside. In that moment, it was clear, both of them were stepping into a new social sphere, one defined not by corporate ladders or shallow gatherings, but by genuine connection and unspoken promises of what could be. The following week at Westbridge Solutions introduced a new dynamic between Thomas and Helena. Each morning, Thomas would arrive at his desk with a sense of anticipation, wondering if their paths would cross. Often they did, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes in the break room. While they didn't arrange formal meetups, every encounter carried an undercurrent of evolving familiarity. On Tuesday, Thomas was hurrying to a budget meeting when he spotted Helena approaching the conference room from the opposite direction. She wore a deep blue blouse that complemented her eyes. He offered a warm grin, and she reciprocated with a polite nod, her lips curving in a brief but genuine smile. They both entered the room, filled with colleagues from various departments. Helena took a seat near the front, scanning through documents that outlined the company's quarterly expenses. Thomas, usually quick to choose a seat at the back, felt oddly compelled to sit nearer to her. He ended up just a row behind, close enough to notice the subtle scent of her floral perfume. During the presentation, Martin Reynolds rattled off numbers, emphasizing the urgent need for cost control. At one point, Helena raised her hand to clarify a miscalculation. Thomas watched in admiration as she calmly and accurately pointed out an error in Martin's slide, prompting him to stammer and correct himself. The rest of the room shifted uncomfortably. Martin was known for his pride, and being shown up, even politely, rarely sat well with him. When the meeting ended, Martin shot Helena a frosty glance before sweeping out. Thomas lingered near the exit, waiting for Helena. "That was brave," he said as she emerged, binder in hand. "And much needed. You saved everyone from misinformation." She shrugged modestly. "I'm just doing my job." He walked with her toward the elevators, the usual bustle of office life swirling around them. "You know, your ability to stand firm like that, it's admirable." Her cheeks tinged pink, though she responded with a touch of sarcasm. "I'm sure Martin appreciated it," she quipped, pressing the elevator button. Thomas laughed softly. "I doubt it, but he'll just have to deal with the truth." Their conversation was cut short by other co-workers filling the elevator, but the lingering warmth of that moment stayed with Thomas for the rest of the day. He felt an undercurrent of protectiveness toward Helena. He also recognized, in himself, a growing respect for her intelligence and composure, things he'd once overlooked. That afternoon, he saw her again in the break room, nibbling on a granola bar. He set aside his usual bravado and joined her. "Mind if I sit?" She shook her head, offering him a small, welcoming smile. "Go ahead." For a few minutes, they talked about mundane office matters. A system upgrade the IT department was rolling out, the sometimes convoluted new HR policies. Their banter was light, but beneath it, Thomas sensed an emotional shift, one that made him acutely aware of how she leaned forward when he spoke, or how her eyes flickered with empathy when he mentioned stress at work. At one point, he gathered the courage to ask, "Hey, have you had a chance to think about that coffee we mentioned?" She hesitated, looking at the time on her phone. "I have, actually. Maybe this Friday, after work." His heart did a small leap. "Friday works. I know a quiet spot near the waterfront." She agreed with a gentle nod, and they parted with a mutual sense of expectation. Thomas left the break room feeling lighter, though a hint of anxiety crept in. He'd navigated countless social scenarios in his life, yet something about this felt more substantial than a typical date. Could he handle real vulnerability? That evening, while scrolling through messages on his couch, Thomas received a text from an old party friend, Jake, inviting him to a club downtown. Thomas stared at the words, remembering how many nights he'd lost in that pulsating environment, fueled by loud music and fleeting encounters. This time, he declined with a polite, "Maybe some other time." Part of him felt nostalgic, but a stronger part sensed those days were slipping behind him. He glanced at the battered copy of War and Peace on his coffee table. Opening to the chapter he'd bookmarked, he read a few paragraphs. The text was challenging, full of complexities and reflections on human nature. Yet he found parallels to his own emotional journey, people in those pages discovering new layers to themselves in the midst of upheaval. By the time he put the book down, he was more certain than ever that his relationship with Helena was not just some friendly fling. He appreciated her integrity and intelligence, and he was discovering the unfamiliar satisfaction of connecting on deeper levels. Change can be unsettling, he thought, recalling Harriet's advice about consistency. But if the reward was something genuine, like Helena's patient smile or her unfeigned concern for colleagues, then it was worth the discomfort of stepping away from old patterns. In the grand scheme, Adjusting to these new emotions felt like learning to see in a different light, and for once, Thomas wasn't afraid to let that light reveal the better parts of him. Friday morning dawned with a crisp clarity that matched Thomas's mood. He had spent most of the week preparing for a major presentation to a potential client, feeling a renewed sense of focus. Now, as he dressed for work, he also felt a ripple of anticipation. He and Helena were finally going for that coffee after hours. He reached the office earlier than usual, reviewing his slides and pacing the conference room. When the meeting began, Martin Reynolds hovered by the side, arms crossed. Thomas presented confidently, weaving data points and storytelling in a way that resonated with the client's representatives. By the time he finished, they seemed impressed. Even Martin, normally stingy with compliments, muttered a gruff, "Well done." In the hallway afterward, Harriet Lewinsky stepped forward, offering a gentle pat on his shoulder. "Nice job. I can see you've put genuine effort into this." Thomas let out a breath, smiling. "Thanks. I'm relieved it went well." Harriet glanced at Martin, who was already striding off to another meeting. "Just keep up that honesty and thoroughness," she said quietly. "Martin respects results, even if he doesn't show it. And if you ever need a sounding board again, my door is open." He nodded, recalling their unexpected conversation at the cafe. Harriet had become an ally of sorts, a mentor, though she'd never claimed that title. She quietly cheered him on, free of office politics. Later, as lunchtime approached, Thomas noticed Helena's office door slightly ajar. She rarely kept it open, so he took it as an invitation. Knocking softly, he peeked inside. The space reflected her personality, neat and functional, with a small potted plant on the windowsill and a couple of framed photos on the desk, one of her late mother and one of Helena herself at some academic ceremony. "Hey," he said, stepping in, "I just wanted to let you know the presentation went pretty well this morning." She smiled, looking up from her computer screen. "That's great news. Congratulations." He leaned against the doorframe. "Thanks. So, about our coffee later. We still on?" Helena's eyes held a flicker of amusement. "Yes, absolutely. I just need to wrap up these monthly finance reports." "Where should we meet?" Thomas offered the name of a small waterfront cafe he'd discovered by chance a few years back. "Quiet place, good view, decent coffee?" "Sounds perfect," Helena replied, her tone warm. The remainder of the day felt like a countdown to an event that, on the surface, was just coffee. But for Thomas, it signified an important step in breaking old patterns. Come 5 o'clock, he shut down his computer and made his way to the lobby. To his surprise, he saw Harriet there, exchanging a few words with Helena. He caught only snippets. Harriet congratulating Helena on something, Helena nodding in gratitude. He wondered if Harriet was also an ally to Helena, guiding her in the way she gently guided him. Once Harriet departed, Thomas joined Helena. "Everything okay?" he asked. She smiled. "Yes. Harriet was just complimenting me on my thoroughness with the new budgeting system. She said it's a relief to know someone's double-checking numbers." Thomas's heart lifted. "That's exactly what I keep telling people, but you do it quietly, so not everyone notices." Helena shrugged, brushing off the praise. "Ready to go." Together, they walked a few blocks to the waterfront. The cafe wasn't large, a handful of tables by tall glass windows overlooking the bay. A barista greeted them with a friendly wave, and they found a seat near the window where dusk was beginning to settle over the water. Thomas ordered a cappuccino, Helena a simple latte. As they waited, they talked about the usual office shuffle, mergers, potential expansions, the challenges of pleasing management. But once the cups arrived, their conversation veered into personal territory. "It's nice to hear Harriet's been encouraging you," Thomas said, stirring his cappuccino. She's done the same for me. I'm grateful. Helena sipped her latte, nodding thoughtfully. She's a rare type in the corporate world. She sees past office politics and focuses on real human connection. I guess that's why she's respected across departments. Thomas smiled. In a weird way, she's like a quiet compass, pointing us in the right direction. Helena met his gaze, a hint of agreement in her eyes. I never expected someone like her to care about my work. Or about me, honestly. It's easy to get overlooked. He reached out, almost touching her hand, but stopping short. You're not overlooked anymore. People are starting to see your value. She looked down, a faint blush warming her cheeks. Thanks to you, perhaps. I've never been one to draw attention, but it helps to have an ally, you know. Thomas nodded. Feels like we both have a few allies now. Some we expected, some we didn't. They lingered long after their cups were empty, the conversation flowing like gentle waves against the pier. Neither seemed eager to leave. Outside, the sunset bathed the bay in soft oranges and pinks. For a moment, Thomas imagined Harriet's gentle words echoing in his mind, advising patience, authenticity, and kindness. He realized, with Helena sitting across from him in the warm glow of twilight, that he was part of a circle of support he'd never really known before. In that realization, he felt a surge of calm confidence. He wasn't alone. He had people rooting for him, and he was learning to root for others too. The following Monday started like any other, emails to check, calls to return, marketing briefs to revise. Thomas dove into his tasks, riding the wave of renewed motivation, yet by mid-morning he sensed a shift in the office's atmosphere. Whispers and concerned looks exchanged among co-workers hinted that something had gone amiss. He found Carlos in the hallway, fiddling with a USB drive. You hear what happened? Carlos asked, voice low. Thomas shook his head, bracing himself. No, what's going on? Carlos glanced around, then leaned closer. Apparently, there's a massive discrepancy in one of the company's biggest accounts. People are pointing fingers at Helena's department because it's a financial oversight. But from what I've heard, it might be a result of poor coordination with another division. Thomas's chest tightened. Poor coordination. Or sabotage. Carlos grimaced. Too early to say. But some folks are quick to blame Helena. Since she's been auditing a lot of the accounts, they claim she must have missed something. A flare of protectiveness rose in Thomas. That doesn't sound like her. She's meticulous. Carlos nodded in agreement. Exactly. But you know how office politics can be. It's easy to scapegoat a quieter employee. Without thinking twice, Thomas made a beeline for Helena's office. The door was shut, and through the frosted glass he could make out her silhouette hunched over papers. He knocked gently. She opened the door, visibly stressed, dark circles under her eyes. Thomas, she said in a subdued voice, I'm guessing you heard. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Carlos filled me in. This can't be your fault. She gestured to a stack of documents on her desk. I've been reviewing everything for the last 2 hours. So far, I see no error on my end. The numbers line up in my system, but Martin is demanding a meeting to resolve the incident. Thomas inhaled slowly, rage flickering at the edge of his calm. He wants to pin this on you, doesn't he? A defeated sigh escaped her. I don't know what he wants, except to fix the problem without tarnishing the company's reputation. Someone has to take the blame. He took a seat across from her, leaning forward. Let me help. I can't crunch the numbers like you can, but I can talk to Harriet. Maybe she'll ensure there's a fair review of what really happened. Helena hesitated, eyes glistening with anxiety. I don't want to drag you into this. You're not dragging me anywhere, he replied softly. I'm here by choice. She swallowed hard, nodding. All right. Thomas stood to leave, pausing at the door. Hang in there. We'll figure this out. Within the hour, Helena was called into an impromptu meeting with Martin, a few senior managers, and a couple of board representatives. Thomas took the chance to approach Harriet. He found her in a corner office, going over files. "Harriet," he said, keeping his voice controlled, "I'm sure you've heard about the discrepancy." She pressed her lips together. "I did. And I suspect Martin is pushing for a quick scapegoat," he explained Helena's situation, describing the thoroughness with which she approached her job. Harriet listened intently, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do to make sure proper procedures are followed. No one should be blamed without evidence." Meanwhile, the meeting ended. Helena emerged, her expression a mixture of frustration and anxiety. Thomas caught up to her in the hallway. "What happened?" he asked, eyes scanning her face. She exhaled shakily. "Martin demanded I produce a full report by tomorrow morning that proves exactly where the error originated. If I can't, he implied I should consider stepping down or transferring to another department." Thomas's pulse pounded. "That's absurd. He's basically setting you up." She forced a calm tone. "I've got tonight to finalize my findings. Maybe if I can prove who really overlooked the issue, it'll clear my name." He glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. "You shouldn't have to do this alone." Helena looked at him, fatigue evident in her eyes. "I appreciate that, but I've survived plenty of battles by myself. I'm just not sure if I can handle the pressure this time. The stakes feel higher." A fierce determination ignited within him. "You won't be alone. I'll stay late and help however I can, even if it's just organizing files or bringing you coffee." Her lips curved into a grateful half-smile. "Thank you." They returned to their desks, but after hours, when the building had mostly emptied, Helena found Thomas at her office door with a folder of supporting documents he'd gathered from marketing archives. Together, they cross-referenced data points, verifying timelines and calculating budgets. As midnight approached, they discovered a clue, a set of invoices authorized by a different manager, someone in the procurement division, seemed unaccounted for. If that was the root cause, Helena had been correct all along. The error wasn't hers. She shot Thomas a look of relief mixed with uncertainty. "We might have enough to prove my department isn't to blame, but what if Martin ignores it?" Thomas squared his shoulders. "Then we'll take it higher. Harriet, or even the board if we must." Helena's eyes glimmered with cautious hope. "You really are willing to fight for this?" He nodded. "I am, and for you." They worked a little longer, finalizing the report. By the time they packed up to leave, it was nearly 1 a.m. In the silence of the deserted office, they exchanged a look, part gratitude, part worry. This was only the first confrontation. The real test would come in the morning when Martin saw their findings, yet neither of them felt entirely powerless anymore. Walking out into the cool San Francisco night, they shared a quiet solidarity. Thomas realized that, despite the exhaustion, he felt oddly alive. He was risking his standing at the company, but for once, he knew it was the right thing to do. And Helena, though stressed, carried herself with a renewed sense of determination. Their alliance, forged in the late-night glow of spreadsheets and coffee, was far more meaningful than any casual fling he'd known before. They parted ways in the parking lot, exchanging a brief, earnest goodbye. Tomorrow held uncertainty, but it also held the promise of truth, and for Thomas and Helena, that was worth the fight. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Westbridge Solutions, but Helena barely noticed. She clutched the thick binder of evidence she and Thomas had prepared the previous night, feeling exhaustion tug at her every step. The faint hum of office conversations surrounded her, a steady buzz that underscored the seriousness of the day. Thomas caught up to her near the elevator bank. He, too, looked tired, eyes slightly red, hair less neatly styled than usual. Yet there was a purposeful determination in his voice as he asked, "You ready for this?" Helena let out a shaky breath. "As ready as I'll ever be. Martin's expecting my full report in 10 minutes. I just need to stay calm." They rode the elevator together to one of the upper floors, where an emergency meeting had been called. Carlos and Bethany were already waiting outside the conference room, their expressions a mixture of worry and support. "Hey," Carlos said softly. "We're here if you need anything." Bethany nodded, offering a tentative smile. "Just remember, the numbers are on your side." Helena mustered a grateful look. "Thank you both." Inside the conference room, the tense atmosphere was palpable. Martin Reynolds stood at the head of the long table, arms crossed. Several department leads filled the seats, murmuring among themselves. Harriet Lewinsky had managed to secure a spot near the front, and she offered Helena an encouraging nod. Martin began the meeting with a curt introduction. "We're here to address a serious financial discrepancy in one of our largest accounts. Mrs. Carter," he gestured to Helena, "will present her findings. Let's keep this concise." Helena swallowed hard. She set her binder on the table, clicked through a series of slides on the overhead projector, and methodically explained the timeline. She showed how certain invoices were never recorded properly by the procurement division, leading to a mismatch in the finance department's final reports. Her voice, though soft, carried confidence. "These documents," she turned a page, "demonstrate that our audits flagged missing data weeks ago, but the updates were never implemented." Thomas, seated behind her, watched with pride. Despite her anxiety, Helena spoke with calm clarity. Midway through, she invited questions. A few department leads pressed her on details, but each time she pulled up data to refute any suggestion of negligence on her part. Finally, Martin interjected, "Are you implying procurement is fully responsible? That's a serious accusation." Helena met his gaze. "I'm saying the records show a failure to communicate invoice updates. I'm not blaming individuals by name. But the fault does not lie with finance alone, or with me." A flicker of annoyance crossed Martin's face. He flipped through the binder she'd provided, scanning the evidence. The room grew silent, tension thick in the air. Then Harriet spoke. "I've reviewed these materials briefly," she said, "and it seems Ms. Carter's assessment is correct. The oversight occurred outside finance's direct responsibility. My recommendation is that we investigate procurement's protocols." A murmur spread around the table. Martin looked cornered. He cleared his throat, attempting to maintain composure. "We'll launch a formal review. In the meantime, Ms. Carter, you'll continue working on financial oversight, but I expect this to be resolved quickly." With that, the meeting was adjourned. Helena exhaled, as though she'd been holding her breath for an hour. Thomas placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, murmuring, "You did it. You proved your case." As attendees filed out, Harriet caught Helena's eye. "Good job. You should be proud of yourself." Helena nodded, relief flooding her. Yet she knew this victory was only the first step. Martin's stern demeanor suggested he wouldn't forget how she'd challenged him so openly. And the procurement division might resent her revelations. Still, for the moment, it felt like a small conquest. Outside in the hallway, Bethany gave Helena a light embrace, and Carlos grinned broadly. "You've got guts, Helena," he said. "I doubt Martin expected you to come so well prepared." Thomas guided Helena to a quieter corner, away from the residual energy of the meeting. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I'm relieved." But I can't shake the feeling that Martin will find another way to shift blame if this gets worse. Thomas grimaced. We'll deal with that if it happens. For now, let's focus on the fact you stood your ground. Their eyes locked, a current of mutual respect running between them. Helena sensed it was more than just relief at escaping a false accusation. It was the deepening bond that had grown during those late-night hours spent uncovering the truth. As the day wore on, Helena noticed subtle ripples of this confrontation spreading through the company. A few colleagues from other departments offered quiet nods of encouragement. One or two even approached her to ask questions about proper invoice handling. Though small, these gestures suggested a growing recognition of her competence. Thomas, for his part, kept a wary eye on the corporate terrain. He realized that even though Helena had won this round, the real battles might be yet to come. Martin's reputation hinged on maintaining order, and a determined accountant had just poked holes in that veneer. But amid the tension, a new sense of inner fortitude blossomed for Helena. For the first time in her career, she'd faced off with senior management and emerged with her integrity intact. It felt like a tipping point. She still had doubts and fears, but each small triumph fueled her confidence. At the end of the day, Helena and Thomas headed out together. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. The trials were just beginning, but they were forging a resilience that neither had expected. And in that shared resilience, they found renewed hope for whatever challenges lay ahead. A few days later, Helena found herself in a reflective mood. The near miss with the finance scandal still weighed on her. Though she'd proven her innocence, subtle tension lingered within the company. Certain procurement employees shot her wary looks in meetings. Martin continued to maintain a polite but chilly distance. One afternoon, she decided to take a breather in the courtyard on the ground floor of Westbridge Solutions. Small tables and neatly trimmed bushes created a pocket of calm amid downtown hustle. She sat alone, sipping a cup of herbal tea, letting her thoughts roam. Snatches of memory tugged at her. She thought back to her early 20s, when she had accepted her first accounting job. She'd been idealistic, believing hard work and honesty would guarantee respect. Instead, she often found herself overshadowed by louder, more assertive colleagues, and once even framed for a mistake she didn't commit. Though that time, she hadn't had the courage or the support to fight back. Now, the echoes of that old wound resurfaced. Am I just reliving the same pattern? She wondered quietly. Constantly proving I deserve to be here. As she wrestled with these thoughts, Thomas walked into the courtyard. The midday sun glinted off his hair, and he had a gentle look of concern. I asked around. Harriet said I might find you here. Helena tried to smile, just needed some fresh air. He joined her at the small table. Mind if I sit? She shook her head, her gaze turning toward the potted plants. No, go ahead. For a moment, neither spoke. The city sounds drifted from afar, car engines, muffled horns, the murmur of passers-by. Finally, Helena broke the silence, words tumbling out more vulnerably than she intended. Sometimes I wonder if I'll always have to fight twice as hard just to be heard. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You've proven your capabilities. A lot of people see that now. She nodded, but a bitter edge tightened her tone. Some do, but others, she sighed. I'm not naive. Office politics exist everywhere. I'm just tired of feeling like the underdog. It's a lonely position. A shadow crossed Thomas's face. I understand lonely. I've been there too, though for different reasons. She met his eyes, a question forming on her lips. He sensed it and continued, I used to think the best way not to get hurt was to keep everything on the surface. No serious relationships, no deep attachments. But it ended up leaving me isolated, surrounded by people but alone. Helena studied him quietly, her heart twinging with empathy. I had no idea. He exhaled. It's something I've been reflecting on a lot lately. You're not the only one searching for a healthier place here at Westbridge, professionally and personally. Her hand drifted toward his arm, resting there lightly, a gesture of shared understanding. She was amazed at how easily Thomas opened up now. In the past, he seemed so self-assured, even cavalier. But behind that exterior, she realized, lay a man grappling with his own anxieties. They lapsed into a companionable silence until Helena voiced a lingering thought. I guess the real question is how to keep doing what's right when you're afraid of what it might cost. Thomas looked off into the distance, pondering. Maybe we lean on each other, and others like Harriet, Carlos, and Bethany. We stay ethical, even if it means confronting people like Martin, and we accept that not everyone's going to like it. She breathed in, then out, feeling a measure of relief. You make it sound almost doable. He gave a lopsided smile. That's the thing about fear. It shrinks a bit when you talk about it with someone you trust. Her cheeks warmed. The word trust hung between them like a small, precious lantern. A part of her yearned to trust him fully, but old scars from past betrayals made her hesitant. Still, she sensed Thomas was genuine, a feeling that soothed her usual caution. Eventually, they rose to return to their tasks. Before they parted ways, Helena touched his hand again. Thank you, she said softly, for listening. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Anytime. Later that evening, Helena arrived home to her small apartment and set down her purse with a weary sigh. She made a simple dinner, then settled onto the couch, letting the silence of the space wrap around her. Her mother's photo stood on a nearby shelf, a reminder of how quickly life can shift. Helena traced the outline of the frame with her fingertip, remembering the promise she once made, to live in a way that honored her mother's resilience. I won't give up. I can't. She flipped open her laptop, reviewing files in preparation for the ongoing investigation into the procurement fiasco. Martin's reluctance to accept her findings weighed on her, but she felt a new resolve. If she kept her moral center and held onto the support she'd found in Thomas, Harriet, and the others, perhaps she wouldn't have to bear every burden alone. As the night wore on, she couldn't help but reflect. This is where I grow or where I break. And for once, she believed she had the strength to grow. A few more days passed in a tense limbo, with procurement staff quietly grumbling about additional audits. Though no one openly accused Helena of wrongdoing, rumors floated through the halls. Whispers suggested that Martin might push for staff cuts or departmental reshuffling to cover any lingering embarrassment from the discrepancy scandal. Thomas's protective instincts flared each time he caught drift of these rumors. One afternoon, he overheard a pair of junior associates gossiping near the copy machines. Martin's going to throw Helena under the bus. Bet she's the next to go. He felt anger surge. He wanted to confront them, but recognized it would only fan the flames. Instead, he sought out Harriet Lewinsky in her office, hoping she had insight. Harriet, seated behind her neat desk, steepled her fingers thoughtfully as Thomas recounted what he'd heard. This isn't surprising, she said. Martin needs a scapegoat for the board's dissatisfaction. He can't pin it all on procurement without drawing attention to his own oversight. Thomas's jaw clenched. He'd destroy Helena's career to save face. Harriet nodded grimly. Potentially, yes, unless he's stopped. But how? Thomas asked, voice tight. Harriet looked at him, compassion in her eyes. We need a unified front. If Helena, along with any colleagues who see the truth, stands firm, Martin can't single her out so easily, but it will take courage. Thomas thanked Harriet and left, frustration gnawing at him. Courage might be what they needed, but Martin wielded substantial power. Is this fight too big? He found Helena in a spare conference room, sifting through spreadsheets. Her shoulders were tense, her focus intense. When she glanced up, the exhaustion in her eyes was clear. "Anything new?" she asked quietly. Thomas explained Harriet's suggestion. "We have to be prepared," he concluded. "Martin might try to block the official investigation or manipulate the board with half-truths." Helena pressed her lips together, looking at the reams of data on the table. "I'm trying to finalize everything for the internal review committee, but it feels like an uphill climb, and the clock is ticking." He rested a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," she managed a tired nod. "It's just, all of this is bigger than anything I've faced before. I'm not sure if I'm strong enough." A wave of protectiveness surged in Thomas. "You're one of the strongest people I know, but I understand it's overwhelming." Despite his reassuring words, a knot formed in his stomach. That day ended with Helena skipping the usual after-work coffee. She needed time alone to tackle an avalanche of reports. Thomas respected her space, but as he headed home, he couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Early the next morning, Helena received an email from Martin's office demanding she present a clear, final resolution to the discrepancy by week's end. The tone was harsh, insinuating that if she couldn't close the matter swiftly, her position might be re-evaluated. She read the email with mounting dread. A final resolution by week's end? That's impossible. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing, and procurement's cooperation was minimal. At lunchtime, Helena briefly joined Thomas, Carlos, and Bethany in the cafeteria. The moment they saw her expression, they knew something was wrong. "Martin's ultimatum," she said flatly, placing her phone on the table. "He's basically saying if I don't wrap this up, I'm out." Bethany's face went pale. "He can't do that legally, can he?" Carlos shook his head. "He'll find a way to force her out if that's what he wants." Thomas, anger simmering in his voice, said, "We won't let it happen." Helena sighed. "I have 3 days to finish a job that should take weeks. I can't conjure reports out of thin air." A tense silence settled around them. Then Bethany spoke up with surprising resolve. "We'll help gather data. I have a friend in procurement who might leak the missing docs." "Under the table, of course." Carlos straightened. "I'll see what I can do with the company's internal database. Maybe track changes that show who made the mistakes." Thomas nodded firmly. "And I'll keep Harriet in the loop. If Martin tries to dismiss you unfairly, we'll raise hell." Helena's eyes filled with gratitude, but also with the weight of the challenge. "You guys, thank you. I just hope it's enough." That evening, they all stayed late, combing through digital records and physical files. Helena identified multiple invoice references that procurement never reconciled. Carlos used his IT knowledge to pinpoint inconsistencies in timestamps, suggesting deliberate backdating by someone trying to cover their tracks. Bethany texted her contact in procurement, hoping to secure more evidence. Midnight came and went. The fluorescent office lights cast a harsh glow on the group's determined faces. Thomas's heart ached each time he glanced at Helena's hunched figure, noticing the strain in her posture. By 2 a.m., the team had made progress, but their findings painted a grim picture. A manager in procurement likely altered records to hide budget overruns, all in an attempt to keep Martin or other senior leaders from noticing. Now, faced with exposure, Martin was pressuring Helena to resolve it quickly, effectively burying the issue. Weariness tugged at them. Helena rubbed her temples, exhaustion and stress evident in every breath. "I can't believe it's come to this," she whispered. Thomas walked over, gently resting a hand on her back. "We're close, Helena. Don't give up." She closed her eyes. "I won't. But it feels like I'm cornered. The insurmountable hurdle loomed, a tight deadline, an influential manager seeking a scapegoat, and the real culprit hidden behind corporate facades. Yet as they shut down their computers for the night, there was still a glimmer of determination in their eyes. They weren't just co-workers anymore, they were allies, bound by a shared commitment to truth and fairness. Whether or not they'd prevail, they couldn't say. But if this adversity had taught them anything, it was that unity and courage could keep them going, even in the darkest hours. 2 days later, Helena emerged from Martin's office with a mixture of relief and lingering tension. In her hand, she clutched a formal notice from the Internal Review Committee. It stated that her preliminary audit, which pinned the discrepancies on a specific procurement manager, would be acknowledged and examined further. For now, Helena's role remained intact, and Martin couldn't terminate her without just cause. Thomas, waiting just outside, scanned her face the moment she stepped into the hallway. So, what happened? Helena held up the notice. They're allowing the investigation to continue. Martin tried to push for a disciplinary review, but Harriet and another board member intervened. Thomas felt a surge of relief. That's good news, right? She nodded cautiously. It buys me time. Martin has to stand down until the committee completes its work, but he's still furious, and it's clear this isn't over. I'd call it a partial victory. Carlos and Bethany rushed over, their eyes wide with anticipation. Helena explained the outcome in subdued tones. Bethany hugged her tight. I'm so glad. We're in your corner. Thank you, Helena murmured. She glanced at Thomas, who offered a proud nod. It's a step in the right direction. But I can't shake the feeling that Martin will try something else. They headed to the break room for a moment to decompress. Over lukewarm coffee, they traded anxious smiles, acknowledging that while the immediate danger had passed, the broader battle remained. That evening, Thomas walked Helena to her car. The sky was tinted with the last shades of twilight, and a crisp breeze swept through the parking lot. "Can I take you to dinner?" he asked gently. "You've been running yourself ragged. Maybe we could talk about something other than audits for a change." Helena smiled, though fatigue weighed on her features. "That sounds wonderful, but I might not be very good company. My brain is half fried from the stress." Thomas lowered his voice, stepping closer. "We'll keep it low-key, a quiet place, maybe a bowl of soup or some comfort food." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's do that." They ended up at a small family-run diner not far from the office. Soft, ambient music played in the background, and a warm glow came from the vintage lamps. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. They each ordered a simple meal, chicken noodle soup for Helena, a turkey sandwich for Thomas. As they waited, Helena finally let her guard down, admitting how the ordeal had dredged up old insecurities. "I've always tried to stay invisible," she confessed, stirring her soup. "Part of me believed that if I just did my job quietly, nobody would target me. But this whole situation has forced me to speak up and stand out." Thomas nodded, empathy in his gaze. "I get it. Putting yourself out there is risky, but you're proving how strong you really are." She swallowed a spoonful of broth, reflecting. "I'm learning that real courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what's right anyway." He took her hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Exactly." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the homey aroma of the diner soothing their frazzled nerves. Then Helena cleared her throat. "There's something else I want to say." He raised an eyebrow, heart pounding slightly. "Go ahead." She looked at him, her eyes softer than he'd ever seen. "I appreciate how you've supported me, not just in the office politics, but personally. You've shown me I can trust someone again." Thomas felt a sudden warmth flood his chest. "It means a lot to hear you say that. I've been feeling the same." Like you've helped me see a different side of myself, one that values more than a quick thrill or superficial success. They lingered over their meals, sharing bits of their past, her mother's illness, his estranged relationship with intimacy, both of them discovering they'd found a sort of solace in each other's company. By the time they returned to the car, Helena leaned against the door, her cheeks faintly flushed with emotion. Thomas, sensing the moment's fragility, tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. "Even if it's only a partial victory at work," he murmured, "I feel like we've made some real progress tonight." She smiled, eyes shining. "It's strange to say, but I'm almost glad these challenges pushed us together. I'd have never let my guard down otherwise." He bent forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Then here's to partial victories, and to pushing forward." That night, they parted with a mutual sense of hope. Helena still had battles to fight, and Thomas was fully aware of how precarious their positions could be if Martin decided to strike back. But there was also an undeniable shift, a realization that their connection, forged in adversity, was growing into something genuine. Thomas drove home, feeling lighter than he had in years. He carried with him the memory of Helena's relieved smile and the sense that, for once, a small win, no matter how incomplete, could spark a bigger transformation. Friday morning arrived with an unmistakable air of tension hanging over the office. The Internal Review Committee had scheduled interviews with various employees, aiming to gather testimonies about procurement's mishandling of invoices. Helena was among those called in for a detailed, recorded statement. Thomas sat by his desk, rapping his fingers lightly on the surface as he waited for Helena to finish. His heart pounded every time he imagined how Martin might attempt to twist the situation. The partial victory earlier in the week had eased some pressure, but the possibility of a counterattack loomed large. At last, Helena emerged from the meeting room, her features drawn but resolute. Thomas hurried over. "How did it go?" She pressed her lips together. "The committee seemed neutral, took a lot of notes. Martin wasn't in there, which helped. Still, it's exhausting having to lay everything out again." He offered a comforting nod. "You did the right thing." Just then, Harriet Lewinsky appeared, beckoning them both aside. She spoke in hushed tones. "I wanted to give you a heads up. Procurement's manager, Collins, is preparing a statement claiming Helena's audits came in late, which prevented him from rectifying the invoices." Helena's eyes widened. "That's a lie." Harriet nodded sharply. "Exactly, but he'll try to present evidence that you didn't send those flagged reports in time." Thomas let out a frustrated breath. "Do we have anything to prove otherwise?" Harriet glanced around, then said, "Check your emails, archives, everything. If you can show timestamps confirming you sent those reports, that'll undermine Collins' claim." With that, Harriet stepped away, leaving a worried hush between them. Helena took a deep breath. "I'm so tired of feeling like I'm on trial." Thomas rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll find the records. Carlos can help." They spent the next several hours combing through archived emails and data logs. Helena felt her muscles tense as she scanned subject lines and file timestamps, searching for the exact thread that would prove her innocence beyond doubt. Eventually, Carlos retrieved old backup files from the company's server and found the crucial exchange. "Here," he pointed to the screen, "you emailed Collins' team 2 weeks before the invoice deadline, alerting them to discrepancies. The timestamps right there." They even replied with a, "Thanks, we'll look into it." Relief washed over Helena. "That's exactly what we need." Thomas grinned, sending the email thread to Harriet as well. "Take that, Collins." By early evening, Harriet confirmed she had submitted the information to the committee. They'd summoned Collins for follow-up questions the next morning. Though the situation remained fraught, Helena could finally breathe a bit easier. Still, as the office emptied out, A deeper fear gnawed at Helena. Even if she cleared her name, Martin might harbor resentment. She feared the long-term impact on her career. She confided in Thomas as they walked to the parking lot. "It feels like every small step forward reveals a steeper climb ahead." He nodded, understanding etched in his gaze. "That's what happens when you decide to stand up for truth. But you're not alone, Helena." "Not anymore." She looked at him, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "I'm grateful for you. Honestly, I don't know if I'd have made it this far without your support." The next morning, Helena woke with a mix of dread and resolve. She forced down a quick breakfast and arrived at the office early, wanting to avoid the prying eyes of co-workers. When she stepped off the elevator, she saw Thomas already waiting with 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you could use a caffeine boost," he said, offering her one. "Thanks," she replied, a small smile forming. "Let's hope the day goes smoothly." An hour later, they heard the news. Collins had been called in for an emergency meeting with the committee. Evidence from Helena's emails contradicted his statement. Rumors buzzed around that Martin would have to address this new development. Harriet found Helena and Thomas by mid-afternoon, delivering a quiet update. Collins's testimony collapsed under scrutiny. The committee now strongly suspects procurement wrongdoing. "Helena, you've basically proven your thoroughness." Though the tension in Helena's shoulders eased momentarily, Harriet's next words were more cautious. "Don't celebrate just yet." Martin's reaction could be unpredictable. The board might still worry about public image. "Keep your guard up." Later that evening, a subdued sense of relief filled Helena's heart. She stepped into an empty conference room, gazing out at the San Francisco skyline. In the reflection of the glass, she saw Thomas approaching behind her. "Everything okay?" he asked. She turned, voice hushed with emotion. "In a matter of days, I've gone from being the quiet accountant to someone who's questioning entire departments. It's surreal and a little terrifying." Thomas stepped closer, his warm presence anchoring her. "Courage isn't comfortable, right? But think about how far you've come." She nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "I realize the hardest battle isn't just with Martin or Collins. It's with my own fear. Fear that I'm not enough, or that I'm stepping over lines I shouldn't. But I'm learning I have a right to stand here, to speak up." A gentle smile curved his lips. "I'm proud of you, Helena." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in a silent vow to face the next trials together. The city lights sparkled below, mirroring the flicker of determination in her eyes. This was the core struggle. Not simply a fight for professional survival, but an internal battle for self-worth and the courage to claim it. The tension in the air was impossible to ignore. By the time Helena arrived at her office Monday morning, rumors had already spread of a critical meeting Martin Reynolds had arranged with the Westbridge board. Whispers floated through each department. This gathering might determine not only Helena's fate, but possibly the entire company's direction regarding ethics and accountability. Thomas found Helena before she could even turn on her computer. He knocked lightly on her office door, his eyes clouded with concern. "Hey," he murmured, stepping inside. "You heard about the board meeting?" Helena nodded, dropping her bag onto the chair. "I did. It's happening this afternoon. Apparently, Martin wants to present new evidence about the procurement fiasco." Thomas's jaw tightened. He's desperate. He knows the internal review has put him in a bad spot. She swallowed, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm guessing this new evidence is just another way to push blame onto me. Or at least muddy the waters." Before Thomas could respond, Harriet Lewinsky appeared in the doorway. Dressed in a tailored suit, she looked calm, yet resolute. "Helena, Thomas, I was about to come see you. The board has invited me to attend the meeting as well. I suspect Martin's planning to use partial truths to sway them against you. Helena forced a steadying breath. Then we'd better be ready. Harriet led them to an empty conference room where they pored over every detail of Helena's audits, the timeline of emails, and the latest revelations about procurement's wrongdoing. They rehearsed potential counter-arguments, anticipating every angle Martin might exploit. As the minutes ticked by, Helena felt the weight of this showdown bearing down on her, a swirl of fear and determination she'd never experienced so intensely. Shortly after lunch, they headed to the top floor, where the board's executive suite awaited. The corridor leading to the room was hushed, with subdued lighting and plush carpeting that only heightened the solemnity. Thomas gently squeezed Helena's shoulder as they entered. "Remember," he whispered, "you've come this far. You're not alone." Inside, a long table took center stage, flanked by imposing glass walls that revealed a sweeping view of the San Francisco skyline. Martin stood at the far end, posture rigid, a digital presentation flickering on the screen behind him. Several board members occupied seats around the table, men and women in polished suits, their expressions guarded. Harriet took a seat near one end, while Helena and Thomas settled in chairs behind her, slightly off to the side. Martin began with a cold efficiency. "Thank you all for attending on short notice. As you know, certain individuals have alleged that procurement mismanaged invoices, but new information suggests oversight by the finance team, particularly Ms. Helena Carter, could be the root cause." Helena's stomach twisted as Martin navigated through slides, the cherry-picked dates and partial documents. He implied Helena's reporting had been inconsistently delivered. The board members leaned in, lips pursed, eyes on the screen. Finally, Martin gestured grandly. "I believe these inconsistencies warrant immediate action. We must consider whether Ms. Carter is the right fit for Westbridge Solutions." At that, Harriet rose. "Pardon me, Mr. Reynolds, but I have data that directly contradicts your narrative." She signaled Helena, who swallowed her nerves and stood. Harriet guided her to the head of the table so she could address the board. Helena's voice trembled at first, but as she recounted the true sequence of events, she found her footing. She displayed a series of emails, each with clear timestamps, to prove she had flagged procurement issues well before the deadlines. Then, Harriet took over briefly, pointing out how Martin had selectively omitted crucial correspondence that would absolve Helena. A wave of murmurs spread among the board members as they flipped through the printed exhibits Harriet had prepared. Thomas watched from his seat, heart pounding with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He could see Martin's composure cracking, his jaw clenched as Harriet dismantled his carefully staged new evidence. One board member, a grey-haired woman named Mrs. Patel, finally spoke up. "Mr. Reynolds, it appears you withheld information from this body. Your presentation is at odds with these authenticated records." Martin tried to recover. There must be some misunderstanding. Perhaps Miss Carter's documents are incomplete." Helena squared her shoulders, her voice firm. "They're not incomplete. They're verifiable, and if you contact the IT department, you'll see every timestamp was archived within our official systems." A tense silence followed. Then another board member, Mr. Hughes, who had once seemed neutral, addressed Martin directly. "Care to explain yourself, Mr. Reynolds?" Under the board's scrutiny, Martin stammered. His explanation fell flat. Vague references to procedural errors and miscommunications. It was a stark contrast to Helena's well-organized evidence. As the meeting wound to a close, Mrs. Patel cleared her throat. "We will need a formal inquiry into Mr. Reynolds's conduct. In the meantime, Ms. Carter's role will remain protected. Harriet, please oversee the next steps to ensure transparency." The final clang of the gavel-like pen signaled the end of the session. Martin, red-faced and visibly rattled, stormed out. Meanwhile, Helena nearly sagged in relief as Harriet and Thomas hurried to her side. "You did it," Thomas whispered, eyes shining with admiration. Harriet added softly, "But stay alert. Martin won't go down easily." Helena nodded, her pulse still racing. She'd just faced her greatest professional confrontation yet and emerged with her integrity intact. As she stepped into the corridor, the city skyline beyond the windows felt brighter, as though the triumph in that room had flooded her entire world with new light. In the days that followed the pivotal board meeting, Helena felt as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The official inquiry into Martin Reynolds' actions loomed, but for the moment she was free from his immediate intimidation. Her finances team showed a collective sigh of relief too, no longer under the cloud of blame. Late one afternoon, Helena decided to take a rare personal break. She stepped out of the high-rise and made her way toward the Embarcadero, the bay shimmering under the sun's farewell glow. She found a bench overlooking the water, its gentle waves lapping against the piers. Seagulls called out overhead, and the crisp salt air reminded her of her first weeks in San Francisco, when she'd arrive at dawn just to catch a glimpse of the bay before heading into the office. She sat down, letting her mind wander over the roller coaster of events. How close she'd come to losing everything she'd worked for. How she had braced herself for the worst, believing her quiet diligence might never stand a chance against a powerful manager's schemes. Yet here she was, still employed, recognized for her honesty, and more connected to colleagues than ever before. Her phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. "You off work yet? Want to meet for a walk?" She smiled, typing back a quick reply with her location. 10 minutes later, he appeared in the distance, hands tucked into his coat pockets, a cautious smile on his face. "Hey," he greeted, taking a seat beside her. The breeze ruffled his hair, and she noticed the slight tiredness in his eyes, likely from his own work demands. "Hey," she echoed, shifting to face him. "Thanks for coming. I just needed to decompress." He nodded. "Makes sense." "Everything's been intense." He reached out, brushing her hand lightly with his fingertips. "How are you holding up?" She thought for a moment. "Better than I expected." The board's reaction was a relief. "I know Martin's next move is uncertain, but at least I'm not under immediate threat." Thomas exhaled a soft laugh, gazing out at the water. "There was a time I'd have said all this was too risky, standing up to someone like Martin, challenging the corporate hierarchy. I would have told you to lay low, keep your head down." Helena turned to him, curiosity bright in her eyes. "So what changed?" He smiled wryly. "You did, I guess. Or you changed me. I saw how living in fear or complacency actually damages more than it protects. Also, Harriet and Carlos showed me a different perspective, one where integrity and loyalty mean more than a fast track to a promotion." Helena's heart softened at his words, and she found herself leaning her head gently on his shoulder. "I'm glad you chose this path." They sat for a while, watching the sun dip lower. The sky blazed with streaks of pink and orange, a quiet spectacle of nature that contrasted with the corporate battles they'd been fighting. The gentle lull of the bay was almost hypnotic. Eventually, Helena straightened. "You know," she began, "it's not just my job that I nearly lost. If things had gone the other way, I might have never felt comfortable getting close to anyone at work again. No real friends, no chance to open up." She paused, glancing up at him. "I'm grateful that didn't happen. I'm grateful for you." Thomas turned and caught her gaze, sincerity lighting his eyes. "I'm grateful too. For the record, I'm the one who should be thanking you for helping me see a better version of myself than I thought possible." A comfortable silence settled over them. The air grew a bit cooler, and Helena shivered. Thomas draped an arm around her, offering both warmth and a sense of safety she hadn't realized she craved. Something about the moment felt healing, as though the chaos of the past weeks was receding to let them both breathe freely. They eventually rose to walk the length of the pier, arms linked. Helena pointed out a passing ferry, and Thomas joked about how he'd once gotten seasick on a company retreat. Their laughter drifted on the wind, a sweet reminder that life could hold such simple joys, even amid workplace strife. When they parted ways at the BART station, Helena felt calmer, a quiet resolve pulsing through her. The day's glow lingered in her mind, a soft reassurance that while the battle with Martin might not be fully over, she had already found a measure of victory. In the reflection of the train window, she caught sight of her own faint smile. She was healing, not just from this latest ordeal, but from old wounds of being dismissed, overlooked, or used, and that, in itself, was a precious reward. Over the next few weeks, the inquiry into Martin's conduct rolled on. Investigations, interviews, and confidential memos swirled around Westbridge Solutions, each new revelation pointing to corners of corporate oversight that had long been neglected. Harriet played a significant role, ensuring the process remained fair. Helena, meanwhile, focused on her day-to-day work and tried not to let the lingering uncertainty consume her thoughts. Thomas noticed a shift in Helena, an undercurrent of confidence she'd never exhibited before. At first, it revealed itself in small ways, the way she spoke up during finance meetings, no longer waiting for permission to share her insights, how she reached out to other departments to clarify data without hesitation. Even her posture changed. Shoulders rolled back, chin raised, as if she finally believed she belonged in any room she walked into. One afternoon, while finalizing a marketing pitch in his office, Thomas saw Helena pass by. He called out, "Got a minute?" She stepped in, hugging a stack of folders. "Sure, everything okay?" "Better than okay," he said, setting aside his laptop. I wanted to tell you how impressed I am with the way you've carried yourself lately. You're not afraid to speak your mind. It's pretty inspiring." A blush touched her cheeks, but her smile was genuine. "Thank you. I guess I'm just tired of feeling small. The whole ordeal with Martin forced me to see that I do have a voice, and it matters." Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "That's exactly it. I feel like we're both changing in ways we didn't plan." He hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "To be honest, I used to worry that you'd never see me as anything more than some office flirt. And sometimes, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to be more than that, you know?" Her expression softened. "I used to believe I was only good at numbers, that nobody really wanted to know the person behind the spreadsheets. You helped show me otherwise." He reached out and gently took her hand over the desk. "We're both stepping out of old labels, I guess." She smiled again, then cleared her throat, returning to a more businesslike tone. "On a different note, Harriet asked me to help with the revised auditing protocols for next quarter. It's a big project, a chance to really shape how the company handles accountability going forward." "That's incredible, Helena," Thomas said, excitement coloring his voice. "You'll do great." She nodded, gratitude evident in her eyes. "I hope so. It's a lot of responsibility. I'm just worried Martin might try to sabotage it behind the scenes, even while the board is investigating him." Thomas's jaw tightened. "We'll handle that if it comes up. You have me, Harriet, Carlos, Bethany, and plenty of others who respect your work." Her eyes flickered with confidence, a quiet acknowledgement that she wasn't alone anymore. "Thank you. Actually, She paused, took a breath. "I was thinking of organizing a small workshop on ethical auditing for anyone interested. An informal thing, after hours. Harriet said the company might allow it if there's enough interest." Thomas beamed at her initiative. "Count me in. No question. And I'll spread the word around marketing. People could use some clarity on finances, and you're the best person to teach it. A mixture of pride and humility lit her face. We'll see if it takes off. If it does, it'll be a sign that Westbridge is truly changing too. They parted ways, each heading to separate tasks. But the interaction left Thomas feeling more energized than he'd been in years. He couldn't help but reflect on the personal journey that had brought him here. Not so long ago, he prided himself on breezing through life, handshakes, cocktails, and short-lived thrills. Now, he found deeper fulfillment in building something meaningful, in supporting someone who matched his ambition but also fueled his better nature. Later that week, Helena sent out an internal email announcing the proposed workshop. Within hours, a dozen colleagues replied with curiosity and support. Even a few from procurement, those who'd once seemed hostile, expressed tentative interest. The seeds of a genuine cultural shift seemed to be sprouting. On Thursday evening, Helena walked to Thomas's office with a box of presentation materials for the upcoming workshop. They ended up chatting for over an hour, fine-tuning slides and discussing potential Q&A topics. Their conversation naturally flowed from business logistics to personal hopes and fears. "You know," Helena said, leaning back in her chair, "I never expected to feel this comfortable around you. I used to think you were just, well, the office charmer." Thomas chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "A fair assumption, based on my old behavior. But I'm not that guy anymore. At least, I'm trying not to be. And it feels good to grow out of that image." She reached across the desk, fingertips brushing his hand lightly. "I see the difference every day." In that moment, the office's fluorescent lights seemed softer, the hum of the air conditioner less obtrusive. They shared a moment of genuine connection, unhurried and unforced. It was a testament to how both had evolved, becoming people who valued honesty, empathy, and real companionship over superficial roles or fleeting validation. Outside, night settled in, the windows reflecting the city's glow. Inside, Helena and Thomas solidified the next steps for the workshop, feeling the quiet sense of triumph that comes with shared purpose. They were each transforming in their own ways, and those changes were knitting them closer together. By the time they left for the night, Helena locked up the materials and Thomas escorted her to the elevator. On the ride down, she leaned against him, and he slipped an arm around her shoulders. Neither needed to speak. Their companionship spoke volumes on its own, proving that amidst corporate struggles and personal doubts, something beautiful and lasting was growing between them. Helena arrived early on a crisp Monday morning to set up for her informal workshop on ethical auditing. The company had approved the use of a mid-sized conference room after hours, a milestone in itself, a sign that Westbridge Solutions was starting to reward open dialogue about transparency and accountability. Carlos helped arrange the projector, tinkering with wires until the screen flickered to life. Bethany placed a tray of coffee and pastries on a side table, wanting the space to feel welcoming. Helena typed on her laptop, double-checking her slides, conscious that this workshop would be her biggest chance yet to demonstrate how finance and integrity could coexist in a corporate world, often driven by profits over people. Thomas arrived last, juggling a small box of handouts. He shot her a confident grin. "Thought you might need these?" "Printed them this morning." Her eyes crinkled in an appreciative smile. "Perfect timing." A few employees filed in, including several from finance, a couple from marketing, and a surprisingly large contingent from procurement, though not the manager at the heart of the scandal. Nevertheless, Helena saw new faces who looked genuinely interested rather than suspicious. "Welcome, everyone," she began, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I'm Helena Carter." Thank you for coming to discuss how we can improve financial clarity and trust throughout Westbridge Solutions. She launched into her presentation, explaining how ethical auditing practices not only protect the company from legal troubles, but also foster a more cohesive work environment. Thomas observed from the corner, noticing how Helena's once reserved demeanor gave way to a poised, articulate speaker. She highlighted real-life case studies, minus any direct mention of Martin's or Collins's wrongdoing, making it clear this was about building a healthier corporate culture, not pointing fingers. The Q&A session that followed felt even more encouraging. People asked thoughtful questions about setting up checks and balances. One procurement associate admitted they'd often been left in the dark about auditing schedules, and they welcomed more collaboration. Helena took careful notes, promising to take these ideas to Harriet and other decision-makers. As the workshop ended, applause broke out. It wasn't raucous, but it was heartfelt. Helena's cheeks warmed with both relief and delight. A few people lingered afterward, thanking her for the insights. Once the room cleared, Thomas stepped up to the podium where Helena was gathering her notes. "You were amazing," he said, voice tinged with pride. She exhaled, smiling. "I feel like I just ran a marathon, but I'm glad it resonated." Bethany ambled over, giving Helena's shoulder a squeeze. "You might have a knack for this, you know. Public speaking, leading by example. It suits you." Carlos nodded in agreement. Everyone in attendance looked genuinely interested, not just checking a box. Helena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. "Thank you all. I couldn't have done any of this without your support." Before she could say more, Harriet Lewinsky appeared at the doorway, a thoughtful expression on her face. "That was quite a session, Helena. I caught the tail end, and I'm impressed." Helena blinked. "You came." Harriet inclined her head. "I've been tracking your progress. The board is also very curious about any initiatives that promote transparency. After seeing this, I think they'll be even more inclined to support reforms once the inquiry concludes." A hum of excitement passed through the small group. Harriet's presence signaled that their push for accountability was gaining serious traction. As they packed up, Harriet pulled Helena aside. "By the way, we've scheduled a final hearing regarding Martin next week. The board will review all evidence gathered, yours included." Helena's heart fluttered. "So soon?" Harriet nodded. "Yes, my sense is that Martin has run out of maneuvers, but I won't underestimate him. Keep your documents organized and be ready to reiterate your findings. If he tries one last stunt, we need to respond decisively." Helena felt Thomas's hand lightly press at her back, grounding her. "We will," he said on her behalf, his voice confident. For the next several days, Helena focused on gathering all the resources she might need for this final hearing. She and Carlos updated their digital logs of communications with procurement, while Harriet drafted an official summary of Helena's audits. Thomas reached out to a few influential figures in marketing and HR who had witnessed Martin's aggressive tactics, encouraging them to testify if needed. Bethany, ever organized, assembled a timeline of events in a concise format. A sense of purpose united them in those hours after the workshop. No one wanted to see Martin slip away from accountability after all the trouble he had caused. And for Helena, it went beyond a matter of personal vindication. She felt a responsibility to ensure that any wrongdoing was addressed so the entire company could move forward with integrity. At night, she found herself both hopeful and anxious. Thomas reminded her that no matter the outcome, she'd already proven her worth and gained allies who valued her contributions. She clung to that reassurance, preparing for what felt like the culmination of her struggle, a final confrontation that would either solidify her place at Westbridge Solutions or threaten to undo everything she'd built. Yet, as the date approached, Helena noticed an odd calm settling in her. She realized she trusted not just her evidence and her colleagues' support, but also herself, her instincts, her moral compass, her newfound resilience. That trust, she decided, was her greatest resource of all. A crisp Monday morning found Helena standing outside the boardroom on the top floor, heart thudding against her ribs. The final hearing regarding Martin Reynolds was about to begin. Sunlight streamed through the expansive windows, casting sharp contrasts of light and shadow across the polished floor. An apt metaphor, Helena thought, for the truth about to come to light. Thomas stood at her side, quietly supportive. Harriet Lewinsky approached, offering a brief nod. "The board is ready for us," she murmured. "Let's go in together." The board members were already seated around the grand table, their expressions serious. Martin, appearing visibly on edge, sat to one side, a folder of papers clutched in his hands. When Helena, Thomas, and Harriet entered, a hushed ripple went through the room. Tension radiated, as though everyone sensed this would be the final turning point. Mrs. Patel, the grey-haired board member who had questioned Martin before, opened the proceedings. "Mr. Reynolds, we've reviewed the documentation provided by Ms. Carter, Ms. Lewinsky, and others within the company. We'd like to hear your explanation one last time before we make a final decision." Martin cleared his throat, scanning the table with practiced composure. "I acknowledge there have been misunderstandings, but to implicate me in deliberate misrepresentation is an overreach. My priority has always been Westbridge's best interests." He proceeded to reiterate claims of minor logistical confusion, occasionally gesturing toward Helena as though her audits had added layers of complication. Helena tensed, bracing herself for another onslaught of half-truths, but this time Harriet stepped in calmly. "Mr. Reynolds, can you explain why you selectively presented data during the last board session, omitting key email threads that clearly stated procurement's oversight?" Harriet asked, her voice even. Martin's face reddened slightly. "I only sought to streamline the review. In hindsight, I should have included more details." Mrs. Patel raised an eyebrow. "Streamline or mislead?" A low murmur rolled around the table. Harriet motioned for Helena to speak. Gathering her resolve, Helena rose, stepping to a smaller podium set up near the head of the table. "The evidence I've provided," she tapped her binder, "shows a consistent pattern. I flagged financial irregularities, sent clear emails to procurement, and attempted to escalate these issues to Mr. Reynolds when no action was taken. Yet, each time, I was dismissed or told to wait. It appears Mr. Reynolds prioritized closing deals or avoiding negative publicity over addressing systemic problems." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'm not here to attack anyone personally. I simply want accountability so Westbridge can learn from these mistakes and move forward responsibly." A thoughtful silence followed. Then Mr. Hughes, another board member, spoke. "We've examined each email, each timestamp, each discrepancy in the logs. The picture is quite clear. This was no mere oversight." He turned to Martin. "We appreciate your contributions to this company over the years, but it's evident you attempted to conceal issues that could have been resolved earlier. That lack of transparency has harmed Westbridge's integrity." Martin's composure finally cracked. "This is a witch hunt," he spat. "One misjudgment doesn't erase my years of service." Harriet interjected, her tone measured but firm. "No one denies you've had successes. But your actions here were deliberate and put our company at risk. The board must decide the consequences." Mrs. Patel consulted the others. After a brief, tense exchange of whispers, she faced Martin. "We'll conclude this hearing with a recommendation for your immediate dismissal. We cannot maintain leadership that disregards company ethics." Martin's knuckles whitened around his folder. He opened his mouth to retort, but a final glance around the table showed no sympathy. In silence, he stood, gathered his papers, and strode out of the room, not sparing a glance at Helena. The board addressed Helena next. "Miss Carter," Mrs. Patel said, "we commend you for your diligence and moral clarity. We also recognize the changes you and Miss Lewinsky have initiated. We urge you to continue these reforms, ensuring that Westbridge becomes a model of financial and ethical responsibility." Relief flooded Helena, so strong it nearly buckled her knees. As the meeting drew to a close, Harriet placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Thomas, from his seat, flashed a relieved grin. Outside in the corridor, the small group of allies, Harriet, Thomas, Carlos, Bethany, gathered around Helena. An electric thrill of victory pulsed through them. "You did it," Bethany exclaimed, clasping Helena's hands. "And you've changed the company too." Carlos nodded enthusiastically. "I've never seen the board act so decisively. This is huge." Thomas, his voice thick with emotion, murmured, "I knew you'd prevail, but seeing it happen is incredible." Helena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, all of you. We stood up for something right, and I can't believe we actually succeeded." Harriet smiled warmly. "This isn't just your victory, Helena. It's a turning point for Westbridge. Now we can build a culture where accountability is the norm, not the exception." A wave of gratitude surged through Helena as she let out a trembling sigh. The confrontation was over. Martin was gone. The question that had haunted her for weeks, "Would I lose everything?" had been answered with an unexpected, resounding no. She had not only kept her job, but found respect and support within the company. Most importantly, she had discovered that her voice mattered, and that standing for truth could indeed change the course of events. Thomas slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her into a gentle embrace. She let the moment wash over her, savoring the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. For so long, she'd lived in the shadows of office corridors, believing her quiet diligence would never outshine corporate power plays. But now, thanks to her courage and the steadfast support of true friends, she had emerged victorious, her moral stance unshaken. They walked away together, the future shining brightly ahead, an unspoken promise in every step. No matter what came next, Helena knew she had already found her true strength and a place where she truly belonged. A week after Martin's dismissal, Helena stepped into the Westbridge Solutions lobby, feeling an odd mix of familiarity and novelty. The towering windows, the sleek reception desk, everything looked much the same, yet it all felt somehow different. It was as though the atmosphere had been scrubbed clean of the tension that once lurked in every corridor. She rode the elevator to her floor, clutching a slim folder of documents that needed final review for the new auditing protocols. The board's decision to remove Martin had sent a ripple of clarity through the company. People seemed more open and willing to collaborate. Even the procurement department, once so wary and isolated, had begun to align with Helena's approach, conceding that transparency would, in the end, safeguard everyone. Thomas caught up with her just as she stepped off the elevator, his eyes bright with excitement. "Hey," he said softly, matching her stride. "Busy day ahead?" Helena smiled. "Always. But it's a different kind of busy now, isn't it? No more side glances wondering what scheme someone might pull." He nodded, leading her toward a conference room. "Exactly. Harriet wants us to join a quick gathering about the official rollout of your revised finance policies." The mention of your revised finance policies made Helena's stomach flutter. Even though she'd been instrumental in creating them, it still felt surreal that people saw her as a primary architect of this shift. Once inside the conference room, Harriet greeted her with a nod, motioning for everyone to take seats. There were about a dozen people, representatives from HR, marketing, finance, and procurement, ready to finalize the details of how Westbridge would handle audits and accountability from here on out. Harriet opened the discussion. Thank you all for coming. Today we'll confirm the timeline for implementing Helena's proposed protocols. We expect a full rollout within the next quarter. Helena's cheeks warmed as the group glanced her way with expressions that ranged from curiosity to admiration. She cleared her throat and began outlining the main points. Mandatory cross-department check-ins, transparent logs of approvals, and clearer escalation paths for reporting irregularities. As she explained, Harriet chimed in with logistical considerations, while a few managers posed questions about practical applications. Thomas sat in the back, quietly observing. Now and then, Helena caught his eye, and a wave of reassurance swept through her, almost like a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this. By the time the meeting concluded, the framework for a new era at Westbridge was taking shape, and Helena felt a surge of pride. As the group dispersed, Harriet approached. "You're doing brilliantly," she said, her tone warm. "But remember, change takes time. Some colleagues may still struggle to adapt." Helena nodded. "I know. I'll be patient." After Harriet left, Thomas sidled up. "That was impressive," he said, voice filled with genuine admiration. "Not just the content of your policies, but how you handled everyone's questions. You've got the makings of a real leader." She shook her head lightly, modest yet pleased. "You're giving me too much credit. This is a team effort." "Sure, it is," he countered. "But someone had to light the spark. That someone is you." They stepped out into the hallway, and Helena felt the weight of his words sink in. A year ago, she'd never have guessed she'd play a pivotal role in corporate reforms, or feel confident enough to defend and guide a project so big. Yet here she was, and it felt strangely right. Later that afternoon, Helena stole a few moments to herself, finding a quiet nook near a window overlooking the city. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, marveling at the swirl of cars and pedestrians below. The hum of the city seemed different, like it was humming in tune with her own renewed sense of purpose. A soft knock on the wall behind her made her turn. Thomas stood there, looking at her with a gentle concern. "Everything okay?" She nodded. "Just reflecting on how much has changed. A month ago, I worried I'd be fired or sidelined forever. Now I'm spearheading these new policies. It's amazing how quickly life can shift." Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You earned it. You fought for what's right. People notice that. It's why they trust you now." She gazed at him, her heart softening at the sincerity in his eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll wake up tomorrow and everything will be back to how it was before." He gave her hand a comforting squeeze. "Not a chance. Too many of us have seen a better way. We're not going backward." She sighed in relief, leaning her head briefly on his shoulder. In that small, quiet moment, she recognized how profoundly her world had changed, not just the company's environment, but her own beliefs about her worth, her courage, and the possibility of forging genuine bonds, even in a place known for cutthroat business. Leaving the window behind, they returned to the rhythm of tasks and emails that made up their professional lives. Yet, an invisible line had been crossed. Helena no longer felt trapped by the fear of invisibility or dismissal. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had glimpsed both injustice and redemption, and had chosen to stand firmly on the side of truth. In small ways, the entire workplace seemed to be shifting along with her. Co-workers from different departments now approached her for input, eager to foster greater collaboration. Meetings that once felt tense and guarded gained an air of collective problem-solving. Even the chatter in the break room seemed friendlier, less laced with hushed suspicion. By the time Helena headed home that evening, The sun was setting over San Francisco, tinting the skyline with gold and violet hues. She paused outside the building, breathing in the cooling air. The world around her was, on the surface, the same. But she was not the same person who'd first walked into Westbridge Solutions all those months ago. Now, she understood that real change, whether personal or corporate, arose from steady resolve, honest communication, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Her steps felt lighter as she made her way to the train. She smiled to herself, thinking, yes, my world has changed, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Around the same time, Helena's personal life took a new turn. She received a call from an old friend in Seattle, Alyssa, someone she used to share long conversations with at a local bookstore. Alyssa announced she'd be visiting San Francisco for a weekend conference and wanted to meet. Helena felt a flutter of excitement, tempered by a hint of apprehension. Would Alyssa still recognize the reserved Helena from the past? Thomas noticed her distraction at lunch the following day. They sat by a window in the company cafeteria, picking at their sandwiches while watching the city bustle below. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting her faraway look. She told him about the upcoming visit. "Alyssa's always known me as the quiet type who never rocked the boat," Helena explained. "I've changed a lot since then." "What if she doesn't like the new me?" Thomas chuckled gently. "I doubt that. Real friends stick around, especially when you've grown stronger. Don't be afraid to let her see who you are now." His words, as usual, offered reassurance. That Saturday, Helena met Alyssa at a charming cafe in the Mission District. The bell over the door chimed as Helena stepped inside, scanning for her friend. Alyssa stood up from a corner table, a broad grin on her face. She was a bit taller than Helena remembered, or perhaps more confident in her stance, but the same warm glimmer in her eyes remained. They hugged, and Alyssa exclaimed, "Helena, it's so good to see you. You look amazing." She took a step back, taking in Helena's simpler yet more self-assured wardrobe. "Something is different about you, in a really good way." Helena relaxed. "It's been a challenging year, but I've learned a lot about speaking up and standing my ground." They ordered coffees, dark roast for Helena, a latte with extra foam for Alyssa, and soon fell into an easy conversation. Alyssa asked about Helena's role at Westbridge, the events that led to Martin's downfall, and how Helena felt about being the catalyst for so many changes. With each detail Helena shared, Alyssa's eyes sparkled with admiration. "I always knew you had it in you," she said. "You were never just a quiet accountant." A warmth spread through Helena's chest. It felt liberating to recount her struggles and triumphs to someone who had known her before any of this. She told Alyssa about Thomas, too, how a seemingly shallow favor for a friend's double date had blossomed into something honest and supportive. Wait, Alyssa interjected with a mischievous grin. "So he started out as a date of convenience? That's priceless." Helena laughed. "Yeah, well, that's the short version. At first, I thought he was this slick marketing guy who only cared about partying. Turns out there's a good heart under that exterior." Outside, the sun was bright and people milled about on the sidewalk, enjoying the weekend. Alyssa suggested a stroll through the neighborhood, so they wandered past colorful murals and street vendors. Helena felt a pang of nostalgia for Seattle's rainy afternoons, but also an immense gratitude for her current life in San Francisco, filled with possibilities she once never imagined. As they walked, Alyssa confided some of her own challenges back home, career doubts, a recent breakup. "Listening to you is giving me courage," she admitted. "You took on a huge risk, and look how much you've grown." Helena paused by a vibrant mural depicting butterflies soaring out of an open cage. "You know," she said, "I used to think security and staying in the background was the only way to stay safe. But now I see that if you don't take a stand, you end up feeling trapped." Alyssa nodded slowly. "Maybe I need to shake things up too, in my own way." They parted later that evening with promises to keep in closer touch. Helena carried a lightness in her heart as she boarded the train home. Seeing an old friend had helped her realize that her transformation wasn't confined to the walls of Westbridge. It radiated into every corner of her life. She felt more connected than ever, not just to new colleagues or Thomas, but also to those who'd known her before, now seeing the woman she was becoming. Back at her apartment, Helena found a sweet text from Thomas. "Hope your reunion went well. Can't wait to hear about it." Smiling to herself, she typed back a quick reply, then set her phone aside. Her mind drifted to the small bookstore in Seattle where she and Alyssa used to linger over coffee, dreams, and worries. If that younger version of Helena could see her now, she might scarcely believe it. Yet here she was, returning to familiar faces with a sense of self she'd once only dreamed of possessing. In that reflection, Helena understood that coming home didn't require traveling back to Seattle. Home was the growth, the knowledge, and the relationships she nurtured right where she stood. A few weeks later, Helena found herself standing in the largest conference room at Westbridge Solutions. Rows of chairs faced a modest stage, where a microphone and podium waited for her. The company had decided to host a mid-year summit, inviting employees from various branches to discuss changes in corporate culture and ethics. To Helena's surprise, Harriet asked her to give one of the keynote talks. Her heart pounded as she watched colleagues file in. She recognized some from the audit workshops, others from the procurement department. A handful of newly hired associates appeared curious, and a few senior managers took their seats with pens poised for note-taking. Before she could second-guess herself, Harriet signaled that it was time to begin. Thomas settled into a chair in the front row, giving Helena an encouraging nod. She adjusted the microphone, clearing her throat. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Helena Carter, and I work in finance." A wave of nerves fluttered in her stomach, but she pushed on. "I'm here to talk about integrity, collaboration, and the human side of accountability." As she spoke, she recounted the pivotal lessons learned from the internal conflicts that once plagued Westbridge. Without naming Martin directly, she touched on the dangers of hidden agendas, the importance of whistleblowing, and the strength found in unity. She shared how open communication, thorough audits, and collective vigilance could prevent the sorts of issues that nearly derailed their company. But Helena didn't stop at policy talk. She wove in personal anecdotes, gently reminding the audience that behind every spreadsheet was a person with vulnerabilities and hopes. She talked about how fear of exposure could lead to unethical choices and how an organization's culture either fueled that fear or eased it. She mentioned how supportive colleagues like Thomas, Harriet, Carlos, and Bethany helped her stand firm when pressure mounted. Occasionally, Helena glanced at Thomas. Each time, he met her gaze with an expression that radiated pride. She recalled the months when neither of them would have predicted this moment, her behind a podium, him cheering her on, both of them part of a corporate transformation that seemed unthinkable before. When she finished, polite applause echoed through the room. Q&A followed, with a few hands shooting up. One woman from a different branch asked, "How do you recommend building a sense of trust when a company's leadership has been shaken by scandals?" Helena considered her reply carefully. "It takes consistent honesty from everyone, especially those in leadership. Quick fixes or slogans won't do it. Trust forms when people see real changes, fair evaluations, open-door policies, genuine dialogue. It's also about realizing mistakes can be opportunities for growth rather than reasons to punish." Later, an older gentleman from HR inquired, "What do you do when employees are afraid to speak up, even if they know something's wrong?" Helena's voice softened. Encourage safe channels for reporting and demonstrate through action, not just words, that those who speak up will be heard, not silenced. In my experience, one of the strongest motivators is seeing real examples of people who were protected or acknowledged for raising concerns rather than penalized. The final question came from a young intern who looked barely out of college. If you could tell your younger self anything, what would it be? A flood of memories rushed in. Helena pictured the timid version of herself who hid behind baggy sweaters and avoided eye contact. She swallowed, then smiled gently. I'd say, your voice matters more than you think. Don't give up on yourself, even if you feel invisible at first. The right people will recognize your worth, and you owe it to yourself to recognize it too. Thunderous applause swelled. Helena's cheeks burned with a mix of humility and gratitude. As she stepped off the stage, Harriet clasped her hand, whispering, "You've found your stride." Thomas was next, giving her a quick hug in the aisle. "That was incredible," he said, eyes shining. "You gave them hope, and not just corporate buzzwords. Real hope." She couldn't help but laugh softly. "It still feels surreal, standing up there. But I'm glad I did it." After the summit, attendees drifted away, chatting about next steps and exchanging business cards. Helena stayed behind with Harriet and Thomas to debrief. Harriet spoke in an upbeat tone. "This is exactly what Westbridge needs. Leaders who aren't afraid to share personal experiences that underscore the policies we're trying to implement." Thomas nudged Helena playfully. "Looks like you're on your way to being the company's resident ethics ambassador." Helena feigned a shocked gasp. "Ethics ambassador? Is that an official title?" Harriet laughed. "It just might be if I have any say in it." Walking out of the conference room, Helena noticed how natural this all felt now, conversing openly about changes, addressing a crowd on matters she once only whispered about. In the hallway, a few employees paused to compliment her speech, and she thanked them, remembering to stand tall, speak clearly, and meet their gaze. Stepping into the elevator with Thomas, she leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment. He kissed the top of her hair, murmuring, "I'm really proud of you." "I'm proud of us," she corrected gently. "We've come a long way." They had indeed, and she realized that by sharing her hard-won wisdom, she'd not only solidified her own growth, she was offering a guiding light to those who might be walking a similarly lonely path. A month later, Helena found herself in a place she never expected to be, a company-wide appreciation event, hosted on a weekend afternoon in a rented space by the waterfront. Bright banners bearing the Westbridge Solutions logo decorated the venue, and the mild San Francisco breeze carried the scent of the sea. Colleagues mingled in a relaxed atmosphere, nibbling on appetizers, sipping cold drinks, and reveling in a sense of renewed camaraderie. Helena stood near a table laden with snacks, watching as people laughed and joked, a stark contrast to the tension and cynicism that once hovered over every corporate gathering. Her revised auditing protocols had started to take effect, with departments beginning to report more transparent figures. It would take more time for the changes to become fully ingrained, but the initial results were promising. Thomas walked over, a plate of fruit in hand. "Everything okay?" She nodded, smiling warmly. "Just taking it all in. A few months ago, I never pictured Westbridge feeling this friendly." He offered her a strawberry. "Neither did I. It's amazing how people can relax when they trust the company's direction. You played a massive role in that." Helena accepted the strawberry, savoring its sweetness. "We played a role," she corrected gently. "You, Harriet, Carlos, Bethany, everyone." "I only gave a little push," he chuckled, then turned serious. "Speaking of Harriet, she wants to talk to you by the pier. She said something about a final word of thanks from the board." Curiosity piqued. Helena excused herself and walked outside onto a wooden pier that stretched over the water. Gulls swooped overhead, their calls blending with the distant hum of boat engines. Harriet stood at the railing, gazing out at the bay. She turned as Helena approached, a kind smile on her face. "You wanted to see me?" Helena asked. Harriet nodded, eyes reflecting the shimmering waves. "Yes, I wanted to tell you in person that the board has decided to recognize your contribution officially. They're awarding you a new position, Lead Financial Integrity Officer." Her smile broadened. "It's a mouthful, I know, but it essentially means you'll oversee ethical compliance throughout the finance department." Helena's heart leaped. "That's quite an honor," she murmured, momentarily stunned. I don't know what to say. Thank you." "You deserve it," Harriet replied firmly. "And if you accept, you'll have more resources to maintain the transparency you've fought for. It's not just a title. It's a commitment from the company that they want to keep growing in this positive direction." Wind ruffled Helena's hair as she leaned against the rail, letting the magnitude of the offer settle in. A few months ago, she feared losing her job entirely. Now, she was being entrusted with spearheading corporate ethics. "I accept," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. Harriet gave her a congratulatory hug. "This is a new chapter, Helena. The board will make an official announcement next week, but I wanted you to hear it first, and I wanted to say personally how proud I am of your courage, professional and personal." Helena swallowed back a surge of emotion. "You've been a mentor to me, Harriet. I couldn't have done this without your support." They parted with a shared sense of accomplishment. As Helena walked back toward the event, a peaceful clarity overcame her. She felt as if she were stepping into a more honest, fulfilling phase of her life, one she'd earned through trials and determination. She soon spotted Thomas, who looked up from a conversation with Carlos and Bethany and caught her eye. Reading the excitement on her face, he quickly broke away and hurried over. "What happened?" he asked, scanning her expression. She whispered the news about her new position. Thomas whooped, scooping her into a spontaneous hug that drew curious glances from onlookers. Helena laughed, not caring if anyone saw. For the first time, being visible felt empowering rather than terrifying. Bethany and Carlos rushed to congratulate her too. Bethany wiped away a tear, joking that she never thought Helena, once the shy accountant at the back of finance meetings, would become a linchpin in reshaping Westbridge Solutions. Carlos teased that maybe Helena's next step was CFO, and she shook her head with a good-humored eye roll. "One step at a time," she said, smiling. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Helena and Thomas wandered to a quieter spot by the water, hand in hand. Waves lapped against the wooden supports beneath them, a soothing background melody to their conversation. He gazed at her, an affectionate warmth in his eyes. "So, Ms. Lead Financial Integrity Officer, how does it feel to reach the end of this wild journey?" She reflected briefly, then spoke from the heart. "It doesn't feel like an end, actually. More like a new beginning. Yes, we've closed a painful chapter, but now there's room to do things right." He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Well, if it's a new beginning, I'm glad we're heading into it together." She nodded, stepping closer until she felt the steady beat of his heart. "Me too. I never imagined I'd find something so genuine in the midst of corporate chaos, but here we are." For a long moment they stood quietly, taking in the horizon. In the distance, a ferry glided by, its lights flickering on as dusk approached. The gentle breeze carried with it the promise of tomorrow, an open invitation to all the growth and possibility that awaited. Helena closed her eyes, savoring the gratitude and calm that flooded her spirit. She thought of the timid woman she used to be, hiding behind oversized glasses and baggy clothes, fearing judgment. That woman had found her voice, defied corruption, and embraced love. Now she was ready to face whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that true strength emerges not from avoiding life's storms, but from learning to navigate them with integrity and hope. With Thomas by her side, she felt confident stepping forward into whatever future lay ahead, a future shaped by the resilience, courage, and grace she had discovered within herself. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.